This storm has caused confusion and delay.
You have caused
Confusion and delay.
that is the pure face prejudice.
Daisy is just the ultimate thought. Daisy is just the ultimate thought.
Your impatience has caused confusion and delay. This storm has caused confusion and delay. You are causing confusion and delay. You cause confusion and delay.
26 years old and you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive. Bit grey today.
I made an error, friends. There was an error. That's the old theme tune. You know what the new theme tune is, don't you?
Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive.
It's only fitting that the Adam Curtis review intro is darker intro for a darker age. Speaking of darkness, how are you, Simon, my old friend?
Hello, darkness, my old friend. Good morning, AA. Good morning, Horace. Good morning, chat. Nice to be here again. And I don't know if you've noticed, it's been raining a bit. And
never stops. It never stops. Not even one tiny little window of cigar action for me in the past week or so. Horace, how you doing, sir?
Sounds like you need like a cigar smoking shelter or something. But yeah, I'm doing all right.
I mean, I do have a big umbrella, and I do have this bench I can sit at when I'm at home, but it's not the same. It's not the same because the temperature also affects the enjoyment of a good, high quality premium Cuban cigar. Anyway, Horace, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right, thank you. Yeah, I'm enjoying these the Curtis series, or Curto as you could call it. Yeah, good stuff.
The Curto. Yeah, I'm still settling into my new rhythm, as it were, and that means I get to spend a lot less time at the lodge, which, among other things, means that I have no supplies at the. I mean, I'm only here like a couple of hours a week now, and I needed to eat something quickly before the show started. I was like, I don't have anything at all, so there's a little shop here, but it was closed. Disaster. So all I had was one of those, those microwavable rices, long grain, which means so I had a bowl of plain rice with butter, very Spartan indeed.
But actual butter though?
Yeah, real butter. Yeah, that was one thing I did have is proper butter.
How the mighty have fallen since the days of Charlie Bigham's.
Exactly.
It's better than it being stork or something, though, isn't it? It's utterly.
Long-time fans of the channel will remember my obsession with Shergar Welsh salted butter, of course. But you can't get that up this way, sadly.
I still haven't had it. I've been looking for it, but I think it's only delivered, isn't it?
It's very difficult to get hold of. But it was during the pandemic. Do you remember there was that period where we were all doing delivered shopping? I think I was getting my deliveries from Whole Foods or somewhere, and they had Shergar. So,
Whole Foods. That's where every apple is sort of waxed and buffed and polished to perfection and costs £5.
Yeah, 19 different varieties of yogurt, but anyway, yes, we better get onto Adam Curtis, otherwise the banter assassins will be onto us. Anything you want to promote, Simon?
No, just the streams and the good works of our friends on this channel and this channel itself. And please check out Horace's Substack. I know he's been doing a lot of good work there lately.
Horace, anything you want to
Well, that's kind of you, Simon. Thank you. Yeah, there'll be a new article out soon on my Substack. So yeah, it's the link is below the video.
I'll just mention. I mean, obviously, do buy courses. I'll play the Trivium. I'll play one of the ads in a moment. More people are doing the Trivium than ever before, leveling up their writing and rhetoric and logic skills. So you too should join part of that growing tribe. But one of the things, like since I've done the channel revamp, I've become particularly obsessed with thumbnails, which is, I think, make very little difference. I think it's much overblown. But you know, when you have a new system, there's a new system. There needs to be a new start. There's a new total system, and I'm increasingly annoyed that things aren't in line. And Adam Curtis is existing as a holdover from the previous regime. And I was thinking, well, do we embrace Adam Curtis as part of the new regime? And does that mean bringing its thumbnails in line? And as I was eating that rice, I was eating rice and updating Adam Curtis thumbnails. Now you see, most of the Curtis thumbnails are in this style here. But I've made a start of bringing them in line. Look.
Oh yes.
They're joining the era of teal. And
crush the subversion.
Yeah, I mean, I've been I've done up to 13, but I think that Google Cache takes a while to update. But slowly but surely, Adam Curtis will be turning teal. Everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is happening. And the thing is that I don't know if there are any brakes on this train. I don't know if eventually I'll have turned the entire channel teal.
People might even end up calling you the real teal. Or the teal deal.
Yeah.
Teal. I could start dressing like David Dickinson in a
making big teal bucks.
Yeah, interesting. But anyway, you should do courses at the academic agency. I haven't played this advert for a while. This gets a very rare run out. Turn down your volume, folks. This is one of the louder ones, but you should buy Foundations of Politics. Foundations of Politics, only £350. Buy it now. See the world as it is and not how it ought to be. History is the graveyard of aristocracy. Who says organization, says oligarchy. Who decides, who interprets. The extremes of individualism and socialism meet. That was their predestined course. Foundations of Politics, only £350. Buy it now. All right, yeah, pick up courses. But now we're going to be looking at The Power of Nightmares Part 2. Picking up where we left off last time, really. And I mean, one of the main, I've chosen for the headline topic here, how the Neocons and the Islamists teamed up against the USSR. That's kind of what we're covering here. Mortal enemies, now friends for a little while.
Yes.
Almost a pro wrestling storyline. Not friends at the moment, it has to be said, given what happened yesterday. I may even do an emergency stream later. Let's see how I feel. If I'm not too tired, I may even do an emergency stream about... because you know what happened? I did my office hours. And during office hours, I said, Israel are absolutely wiping the floor with their opponents at the moment. There's no response. Iran are getting cucked. They look like chumps. And literally half an hour after I finished that show... the fireworks of last night happened. So yeah, I'm yet to see. I don't really know if I have any further info on that, really. We're getting the usual narratives of no damage was done versus other people saying actually damage was done. But anyway, so there it is. But Horus, are you ready to give your life for this war, sir?
No.
How are we all feeling about fighting in World War III?
No, I despise everyone involved, especially especially Robert Jenrick and people from Reform. people like that.
Robert Jenrick said the other day that we should fly the Star of David at the borders to show how much this country is supports Israel. Yeah.
I haven't looked this morning, but I'm sure Farage will be getting on this train. Tice probably. I see Rupert Lowe has already been saying, we've got to give him every support. And the Reform's budding youth, I don't know if you call them the youth wing, youth pretenders.
Twink wing, I call it.
Yeah, the twink prick wing. Yeah, they are having some fun with this as well. One in particular, I don't want to say his name because I don't want to give, because he's a disgusting self-promoter, but he's big into this. Yeah, seems to be trying to take over Reform in a few years. Yes,
his nickname is Licksack, I believe.
He's obviously being promoted by various people.
This is something I don't know if I mentioned this to you when we met, Horace, but there's something about politics of the right and lots of gay men going together, isn't it? And I don't know how that gets sorted out as an issue, but it seems to me that, we talk about Robert Conquest's second law, any space that is not explicitly right wing becomes left wing over time. Well, I reckon there should be another rule, which is any right wing space that is not explicitly exclusionary of homosexuals becomes increasingly homosexual over time.
Well,
I don't know why that is.
I'd like to turn that into a plug, actually. My next piece for
bad word.
Sorry, don't clip that out, please.
Yes.
My next piece for Substack will address this question somewhat. I'm talking about the BBC between the two world wars. The BBC was not founded as a right-wing institution anyway, although John Reith, the sort of first general manager and director general, was somewhat of a sympathizer of Hitler and Mussolini, at least on a few occasions. But under him, anyway, leftists took it over, and just homos. It's amazing. But that'll be all in my next piece on Substack. If you ever want to subscribe, please.
Very interesting indeed. And Horace, is that like behind a paywall, or is it?
No, it's all free. I do encourage support, obviously, but it's all free to read.
Fantastic. All right. Well, with all that said, let us start. Power Over Nightmares Part 2 by Adam Curtis. Directly relevant, I would say, to events in the world right now.
In the past, politicians promised to create a better world. They had different ways of achieving this, but their power and authority came from the
I should tell you, by the way, that I immediately went and got the Prince of Darkness soundtrack. I've been listening to it all.
Bathed in Doomy Carpenter. Yes.
Yeah, I love it. It's great when you're doing work or something.
I actually tried playing it over some of the footage of the missiles last night, actually. I played the soundtrack to it was actually one of his films was The Thing. But actually, Ennio Morricone did the soundtrack. But there was a funny thing because Carpenter commissioned Morricone to do the soundtrack, and Morricone, he didn't give him any brief, and Morricone was kind of desperate to work out how to do the soundtrack, so he just copied Carpenter's style. So there you go.
I've got an image of Simon as a kind of real life Adam Curtis reenactment act.
Yeah,
you've got a kind of ghetto blaster over your shoulder.
Yes.
Pumping out Prince of Darkness soundtrack, and then every once in a while you come in and say, "But this was a fantasy." Or
yes.
I
said the other week actually, I'd love to have Adam Curtis parties. I'd have a home with really long corridors lined by tape reel computers, and everybody would sort of drift towards the kitchen in a state of panicked, desperate, radical individualism.
And then you go into down the corridor, you open the door, and there's some corrupt former Wall Street figure giving an interview in a derelict office. Or in an
empty office. Perfect. You could get the titles to this redone in the style of the current AA channel, with some really long wooden corridors with tape machines running.
Optimistic visions they offered their people. Those dreams failed, and today people have lost faith in ideologies. Increasingly, politicians are seen simply as managers of public life. But now, they have discovered a new role that restores their power and authority. Instead of delivering dreams, politicians now promise to protect us from nightmares. They say that they will rescue us from dreadful dangers that we cannot see and do not understand. And the greatest danger of all is international terrorism, a powerful and sinister network with sleeper cells in countries across the world. A threat that needs to be fought by a war on terror. But much of this threat is a fantasy which has been exaggerated and distorted by politicians. It's a dark illusion that has spread unquestioned through governments around the world, the security services, and the international media. This is a series of films about how and why that fantasy was created, and who it benefits. At the heart of the story are two groups, the American neoconservatives and the radical Islamists. In this week's episode, the two groups come together to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And both believe that they defeat the evil empire and so have the power to transform the world. But both fail in their revolutions. In response, the neoconservatives invent a new fantasy enemy, Bill Clinton, to try and regain their power, while the Islamists descend into a desperate cycle of violence and terror to try and persuade the people to follow them. Out of all this comes the seeds of the strange world of fantasy, deception, violence and fear in which we now live.
This is prime time Curtis right here, Simon. Prime time.
Yes. And you're losing another chunk of money to Brian Eno again this week, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what's funny is that last week I said I was worried about copyright, and you mentioned the possibility of Brian Eno being the one. And immediately after the stream ended, I got an email saying, yeah, your copyright has been claimed by Brian Eno.
Isn't he worth 60 million or something? I think he's got enough money.
He doesn't need it, does he? But
not really, no.
I haven't tried to challenge Eno. Maybe I should. Because the copyright has been released a lot recently. For example, I used a clip of Terminator 2 in a forthcoming video about why I think people should back Kemi Badenoch to be the Tory leader. And the studios released the copyright claim when I said it was transformative or whatever. So maybe Brian Eno will be gracious and allow us to watch these in peace. What do you think?
The idea of you challenging Brian Eno sets some wild images in my head. I can see Robert Fripp turning up to give him backup, with Toyah Willcox in tow as well.
Is this Fripp on guitar here on this Eno track that's been playing?
Don't think so. No, I think that's just Eno's Another Green World album, one of his solo albums.
In the chat, we do have Robert Fripp mentioned.
Excellent.
Bingle said Robert Fripp of King Crimson was on guitar there.
Oh, he was.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, whenever it gets really fuzzy, you know, like the guitars on Heroes or whatever, Robert Fripp is invariably the guitar.
I stand corrected once again.
Heroes by Bowie.
Fripp is all over the Berlin albums. Yeah, he's on. I think the entire album Heroes is Robert Fripp on guitar.
I'm a big fan of Future Sound of London. They also had a bit of Fripp on guitar as well. It's like tripped out electronic stuff.
He has a very distinctive sound, Fripp.
Brian Eno's full name is Brian Peter George St. John Le Baptiste de la Salle Eno.
Wow.
It's not pretentious or anything. Can I just say that I've noticed a few times. So you know when you see people from the 19th century who've never seen a camera before.
Yes.
You see that, and they're kind of some of these old Muslim guys seem like they've never seen a camera before.
They have that 1,000-yard stare. It's stealing my soul.
Yeah.
And the kid going Durka Durka Durka. I mean, you do wonder if the South Park people saw this clip.
Yeah, probably.
In 1982, Ronald Reagan dedicated the space shuttle Columbia to the resistance fighters in Afghanistan.
Just as the Columbia, we think, represents man's finest aspirations in the field of science and technology, so too does the struggle of the Afghan people represent man's highest aspirations for freedom. I am dedicating on behalf of the American people the March 22nd launch of the Columbia to the people of Afghanistan.
Since 1979, the Mujahideen resistance had been fighting a vicious war in Afghanistan against the Soviet invasion. But now, a small group in the Reagan White House saw in these fighters a way of achieving their vision of transforming the world. To them, they were not just nationalists, they were freedom fighters who could bring down the Soviet Union and help spread democracy around the world. It was called the Reagan Doctrine.
It was a small group of people, and yes, we did have. Everybody thinks, oh, the Reagan Doctrine, the Reagan administration, like everybody was for it. No, it was a small little cabal within the Soviet, within the Reagan White House that really pulled this off.
It's funny how that word cabal was used freely back then, but now has got connotations of a kind of boomer conspiracist or something like that. You know?
No shame about organized minorities, though. That's a really interesting guy, actually, I have to say. This is like many Curtis interviewees. There's some figures who he looks kind of just like some guy in a shirt. He's an office guy. He's one of the most interesting figures in this, and you should go and look him up, Jack Wheeler. He is a guy who was called by Sidney Blumenthal the Indiana Jones of the right. He was basically a fixer and an adventurer. He was kind of one of these guys who goes off and does extreme sports. He's a really interesting figure. Do you remember years ago, there was a film about Tom Hanks, Charlie Wilson's War, about a US politician who goes to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen.
Yeah, I remember.
And it's interesting, the contrast with this guy, Jack Wheeler, because actually, Jack Wheeler was the real deal. I think he would have made a much more interesting film. Charlie Wilson was a Democrat congressman who lived a sort of, wild lifestyle. He was a sort of, they made it a sort of whiskey priest story in that film, that he was a kind of, Charlie Wilson was a sort of party guy, doing cocaine, girls and all this. And he kind of gets reformed by the social activism of going to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen. But Charlie Wilson, by the way, was a Democrat. So he gets the film made about him. But so Jack Wheeler is a really interesting figure. He was at 14. He became the youngest person in history to climb the Matterhorn. Right? He swam the Hellespont at 16. At 17, he literally went. This is in the middle of the Vietnam War. He went to the jungles of South Vietnam and he killed a huge tiger, which was called the Man Killer of Dalat, which was terrorizing a village. By 19, he traveled over 44,000 miles around the world. And essentially, he kind of, in a sense, set the genre for kind of danger tourism. And he was credited with this idea of the Reagan Doctrine. And a White House source said he was the one who brought it all together. He took the random struggles and crystallized the concept that they were all part of the same historical movement. And then Reagan started incorporating his talk about freedom fighters into his speeches. And eventually, Wheeler became a very, very popular speaker at right-wing events, but very much in the boomer mode. He would come on stage and say, "We got rhythm, we got soul, we got freedom and rock and roll." And his wife is a beauty consultant who's called Rebel Holiday. But he had a really adventurous life, though.
So he's a spook as well, right?
No, he was actually he's sort of an entrepreneur now. He kind of runs like, sort of danger tourism getaways. It's the sort of thing that people like Callum from Lotus Eaters and Lord Miles do now. And he kind of...
Well, I was about to say, what have you ever done, Anon? Yeah. This guy was killing tigers at the age of 16.
Yeah,
we get Callum and Lord Miles now. They got in that day, they got that dude.
He went off to various countries and got all these sort of guerrilla freedom fighters together and created this sense of them all taking part in this historic struggle for liberation. And then he brought this narrative, this story back to the Washington Beltway, and by chance conversation with a friend sort of found that expertise was useful, and then got in with Reagan speechwriters who sort of took the idea on and made it this narrative of America fighting against the evil empire by these multiple points of contact in these countries where these freedom struggles were going on. So yeah, Jack Wheeler, there's not much out there about him, I have to say, but a very interesting figure, obviously.
What united this small group of ours was the vision of bringing more freedom to the world, more security to the world, to actually get rid of the Soviet Union itself. As a result, supporting the freedom fighters became the premier cause for the entire conservative movement during the Reagan years.
But the Americans were setting out to defeat a mythological enemy. As last week's episode showed, the neoconservatives, who were now in power in Reagan's White House, had created an exaggerated and distorted vision of the Soviet Union as the source of all evil in the world. One of their main influences were the theories of the philosopher Leo Strauss. He believed that liberal societies needed simple, powerful myths to inspire and unite the people. And in the 1970s, the neoconservatives had done just this. Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and other neoconservatives had set out to reassert the myth of America as a unique country whose destiny was to struggle against evil throughout the world. Now in power, they had come to believe this myth. They saw themselves as revolutionaries who were going to transform the world, starting with the defeat of the evil empire.
We're closer to being revolutionaries than conservatives in the sense that we want to change some deeply entrenched notions about the proper role of American power in the world. We want to see that power used constructively and to enlarge the opportunity for decent governance.
Now, this is something that has interested me recently, vis-a-vis the current conflict in the Middle East and the current conflict in Ukraine for us. I have noticed that the old school, the OG neocons, this crew basically, are supporting Kamala Harris in the election, not Donald Trump. But the Zionists at large are supporting Donald Trump, right? It's clear that the hardcore Zionists, the ones who are relying with Netanyahu, they're all for Trump, right? Lots of the new media, Ben Shapiro, they're all for Trump. The OG neocons aren't. And I actually wonder if that is because what Richard Pearl just said here about envisioning a new world and so on, and seeing Russia as the primary enemy, is still very much part of OG neocon thinking. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think also they're just pretty consciously trying to control both parties, so they control the outcome, whatever happens, right? I think that, you know, like, does William Crystal really have any deep affinity to any Democrat, let alone Kamala? Probably not, but also not to the Republican Party. They're just two potential sites of power that both need to be controlled anyway. So I think, I mean, how much do we see much dispute between the straightforward Zionists and the neocons? Probably not, right? I mean, they're mostly in agreement on most points. It's just we need to control both vehicles, right?
Interesting.
Around the world. We're not.
Stop there.
Can
I add something to this about Richard Pearl?
Yes.
You know, we talk about disinformation these days. Well, I mean, these guys, like you say, the OG neocons, these are the kings of disinformation and smear and information narrative tactics in this setting. And the interesting thing about disinformation is, I mean, one of the forms of disinformation we encounter very frequently, like just in our online sphere, is things like the pseudo quote. You know, the kind of, there's always the thing that's, you know, George Orwell said this, and you sort of bow down to it.
Yeah, drives me crazy. Yeah,
I hate it. I can't stand. I block people who put pseudo quotes up on, because they do more harm than good, and it's so easy just to check them out as well. And there's a sort of trope, culturally, historically, of, the mad dictator who swears to kind of take the world with him if he gets taken down. I mean, it comes from as far back as things like, Richard III. He at the last battle, he says, let's to it pell-mell, if not to heaven, then hand in hand to hell. And there was a pseudo quote for years that bothered me, and it was one attributed to the Moustache Man, actually. And it was a quote that went along these lines. It's obviously translated: even if we cannot conquer, we will drag the world into destruction with us. And I looked for this in the historical record and in his writings, and I could never actually find it. So it was obviously a kind of, an attribution to characterize the maniac dictator intent on world destruction. If we cannot conquer, we will drag the world into destruction with us. But it's not there. I looked in his in the book of his struggle, let's say, and I looked in his political testament, and it doesn't turn up. It was always alleged to be something that was said in the bunker. The interesting thing about Richard Pearl is he wrote a book in 2003 called An End to Evil, right? And he actually wrote this. He said, there is no middle way for Americans. It is either victory or Holocaust.
Honestly, they do this in other ways as well. When I say they, I mean, I won't specify what I mean, but they talk in terms of, if you don't let this tribe essentially control your country, you are going to be destroyed. They don't specify how, but they always have this threat just comes again and again. Like, everyone who opposes Israel, they sort of present it as an observation, just an objective thing.
Well,
everyone who opposes us ends up getting destroyed. Just beware of that.
That's why I thought Simon was going with the quote, because the person who closest resembles that sentiment has been Benjamin Netanyahu, with the whole Samson doctrine and, basically the threat to blow up the entire world if they don't get their way.
Again, the politics of fear. That's my point. It's the, if you're talking about disinformation, if you're talking about narrative control, this is how it works.
Happy about the old cozy relationships with dictators.
I should mention, by the way, that is not the only made up quotation or taken out of context quotation that gets passed around by the famous mid-century German. And another one that you may have heard of that I think I had used it at some point in my life is the notion of the big lie. The big lie. Well, if you actually read that quotation in full, he is actually talking about it being used as a tactic by his enemies.
Yeah.
Right. But it is always taken out of that context, as if to say that he is advocating using the quote unquote big lie. He's actually making a commentary on how his opponents operate. It's very interesting. But anyway, let's carry on.
That's very much fed to the boomers, that one in particular. I just wanted to remark on, I'm sorry, just the last thing that Pearl said there, just similar to Michael Ledeen last week, that, we are against these cozy alliances with dictators, right? But these guys never, as far as I'm aware, they never question the alliance with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, obviously, is another dictatorship that goes along with Zionism. And Israel itself is debatable whether that should really be called a democracy. It's a democracy within a certain circle. But these guys, as far as I'm aware, they've never tried to overthrow the Saudis. They might have written the odd essay against them, maybe not even that. But it just seems to be a lie.
It's just friend enemy. I mean, there's the nation of friends who are liberal democracies, or the friends of liberal democracies like the Saudis. And then there are the enemies of the free world, who are all evil dictators and new iterations of the old evil that we fought in World War II over and over and over again.
Yeah, they just use whatever pretextual arguments lead to the right division. They've obviously identified who's friend and enemy on other bases, but they call this philosophy Wilsonianism, or they're with for democracy. Nonsense.
Apparently, it was Goebbels who mentioned the big lie and not the Moustache Man. So there's that. Chatter saying that it was Goebbels, who that quote is taken from. Well, same difference, I suppose. Moustache Man's #1 fan, Goebbels. Right, let's carry on.
And the man who was going to help the neoconservatives do this was the new head of the CIA, William Casey. He was convinced that Afghanistan was one of the keys to this aggressive new policy. America was already sending limited amounts of aid to the Mujahideen. But now, Casey ordered one of his agents to go and form an alliance with the freedom fighters and give them as much money as they wanted and the most sophisticated weapons to defeat the Soviet military forces.
For Casey, Afghanistan seemed to be possibly one of the keys. And so he tapped me one day to go. He says, I want you to go out to Afghanistan. I want you to go next month. And I will give you whatever you need to win. Yeah, he said, I want you to go there and win. As opposed to let's go there and bleed these guys, make it be a Vietnam. I want you to go there and win whatever you need, you can have. He gave me the Stinger missiles and $1 billion.
Yellow is the color of my true love's here in the morning when we rise. In the morning when we rise, that's the time. That's the time. That's the time. That's the time.
American money and weapons now began to pour across the Pakistan border into Afghanistan. CIA agents trained the Mujahideen in the techniques of assassination and terror, including car bombing.
And just while this is getting going, I think it's worth mentioning, because I've noticed, as I've read more history, the Americans have done this basic strategy of tooling up one of these kind of proxy groups to fight on their behalf, and then have that group turn against them literally dozens upon dozens of times since the Second World War. I mean, it's just happened ridiculous. Like, one part of me wonders, like, does anybody ever think, well, we're actually setting up the next, like, is it deliberate? Or are they just stupid? I mean, I just don't, like, are they just thinking, well, okay, we'll use them now and then we're going to turn them heel in 10 years' time, and that will justify more forever wars later type thing? I mean, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's more that they just think it's not going to be a problem. Yeah, we'll just betray them. So what?
Yeah, there's a sort of casual adaptability, I think, in the mindset. It's like, you know, they see, you know, crises as you know, as the Chinese say, represent risk and opportunity. And there's always a way to turn lemons into lemonade. You know, another American cliche. But you know, that clip is interesting because you see, you know, the Mujahideen there on their motorbikes, and you get very much, and they're playing Donovan's Colors, and you get very much the sense that it's framed in this whole move. It's kind of a sense of hippie adventure, you know, that happens in this period. I mean, Jack Wheeler actually identifies a lot of that sense of, it's kind of like, this is just a big outward bound project for people, you know, tired of America. I mean, in that song, there's a interesting lyric, freedom is a word I rarely use without thinking, oh yeah. You know, so I think there's that element of, you know, just make it up as you go along. I mean, you know, there's a line in the film JFK, you know, where there's a character who is being outed as a CIA asset, and he talks about, you know, what they're doing with all these conspiracies. And he just says, it's fun and games, man. It's just fun and games.
Hippies with missiles.
Yeah.
They gave them satellite images of Russian troops to help in their attacks. At the very same time, another group began to arrive in Afghanistan to fight alongside the Mujahideen. They were Arabs from across the Middle East who had been told by their religious leaders that their duty was to go and free Muslim lands from the Soviet invader.
I saw the fatwa, the order, saying that every Muslim has a duty to help the Afghans to liberate their land. But I had no idea, where is this Afghanistan? How can I go there? I've never heard about.
So sorry to pause it again. Something confuses me about the kind of regional Middle East politics of this era, because as this was happening, the Iranian regime was moving closer to the Russians. In fact, there are some people who, in fact, it's a very widespread sentiment in Iran that the current Ayatollah, who remember was around back then and became the Ayatollah in 1989 after Khomeini died, is literally a KGB asset. That he's literally, Moscow trained Russia's man in Tehran. So I do find it interesting that you get one set of Muslims moving closer to Russia, even as they were communists, and another set moving away from them. So I've never quite understood how that is squared or how that works. Because there are elements of Islam that are actually quite socialistic, if you think about it. They don't like interest, for example. There's a mistrust of the banker, let's just say. So there is a kind of a version of Islam that is kind of quasi socialist, Marxist,
behavioral
Islam.
reinforcement, reinforced by mutual policing of each individual.
Exactly. I should also mention there's another communist group that is against the mullahs in Iran, pretty extremist group, who the Americans have always backed as well. So I forget their name now. But
is it Mujahideen Khalq or something? It's
the MJK or something.
M-E-K.
I mean, they're basically like a kind of commie death cult, but they. I remember Radlib telling me that they were welcomed with open arms by pastors in America. I was like, fucking hell, these guys are insane.
And by trigonometry. The first time I ever heard of trigonometry was their guest was Mariam Namazi. You know her? And she's a mental open borders communist, but she was from that MEK group. She fled Iran because of that, because they're banned, aren't they?
Mental.
And apparently when America was, probably not now, but when America was dominant in Iraq, MEK were allowed to sort of operate out of there as a terrorist group, I think. With CIA backing or whatever.
So I mean, it's kind of interesting that even when you have such hardcore ideologies as Soviet communism or American capitalism, they're pretty fluid when push comes to shove. They can buddy up or fight each other as leaders decide.
But spiked.
Spiked, yeah.
The spiked crew, like they're like policymakers for the Tory party, but they are communists anyway.
Yeah, I've never quite worked that one out.
About Afghanistan, I've never heard in the map which airline goes there. From where can I take the visa? 100 question, but I did meet Abdullah Azzam.
Abdullah Azzam was a charismatic religious leader who had begun to organize the Arab volunteers in Afghanistan. He had set up what he called the Services Bureau in Peshawar on the Afghan border. It became the headquarters of an international brigade of Arab fighters. Azzam quickly became one of the most powerful figures in the battle against the Soviets. He was allowed to visit America on many occasions, both to raise funds and recruit volunteers for the jihad.
Well, Abdullah Azzam...
Sorry, just that footage of Abdullah Azzam there in America. It looks like he's doing a set at the LA Comedy Store.
Brickwork, yeah.
Yeah, looks like Bill Hicks is going to be on next.
Became so instrumental in marketing the Afghan cause among the Arabs. He became very important. He became called the Emir of the Arab Mujahideen, the leader of the Arab Mujahideen. And he set up an office in Peshawar, which provided services to Arabs who came and wanted to participate in the jihad. There were no doors closed. All doors were opened because the Americans, the Saudis, the Pakistanis, and many other people wanted the Soviet Union to lose in Afghanistan and to be humiliated. That brought about huge numbers of Arabs from different backgrounds in the jihad in Afghanistan. He went to America, he went to Saudi Arabia, he traveled wherever he wanted because the Afghan cause was a cause that everybody was happy supporting.
But like the neoconservatives, Azam also saw the struggle against the Soviets as just the first step in a much wider revolution. He was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who wanted Islam to play a political role in governing Muslim societies. And Abdullah Azam believed that the Arabs in Afghanistan could be the nucleus of a new political force. They would return to their own countries and persuade the people to reject the corrupt, autocratic regimes that dominated the Middle East. But these regimes, Azam insisted, must be overthrown by political means. He made every fighter pledge they would not use terrorism against civilians in the pursuit of their vision. One of Azam's closest aides was a Saudi, Osama bin Laden.
Osama came to participate in '85. When he came, as you know, he came from a rich family from Saudi, and he had much money to spend. Sheikh Abdullah Azam was a scholar. He can organize the Afghans, but he's not a rich man. So when Osama came, he filled in this gap.
I just wanted to say that the story of Bin Laden is interesting. I don't think Curtis really goes into it much, but the Bin Laden family, they were big in construction in Saudi Arabia. They were one of the most favoured families in the country. I think very close to the royal family, and the royal family was personally very close to the Bush family as well, right? Like a lot of links between them. And the story of Bin Laden becoming this renegade, which he was, by the time of September 11th, he was portrayed as this black sheep of the Bin Laden family. I think that is doubtful. Like it's not clear. Like he may be just an arm's length agent of Saudi Arabia. It's never. I don't think there's ever like any clear proof that he's just like. I think there is proof that he, all through his black sheep time until his death, I guess, he was still in contact with at least some of his brothers, of which he had many. Still in contact with some of his family. So it's as though, to me, it seems like a sort of a kind of a false idea. I think Bin Laden probably did, was there with Saudi agreement. I don't think he was just this free radical that he's portrayed as.
So the main duty of Osama in that time was spending money. Beside his good personal qualities.
But then, in 1985, a new force began to arrive in Afghanistan who were going to challenge Azam's approach. They were the extreme radical Islamists who were being expelled from prisons across the Arab world.
And then, very quietly, most of the governments in the Middle East, the Arab governments, began to empty their prisons of their bad guys and send them off to the jihad with a very fondest hope that they become martyred. Many of them were the people in Egypt that had not been executed after the murder of Sadat, but were implicated in it and been imprisoned. Off they go.
One of the most powerful of these newcomers was...
Just denoting that thing, there's always this thing that recurs in history of people emptying prisons out. I'm sort of, reminded of what Castro, in...
Or Keir Starmer, perhaps.
Well, this is the thing. They always, the clever ones do it to other people's countries, But we do it to ourselves.
That's the premise of Scarface, isn't it?
The Mariel boat lift, I think it was 1980 when he said I'm going to flush the toilets of Cuba onto America.
And American politicians, including Republicans, are just like, yes.
They just see constituents, yeah.
And that, to be fair, Trump is actually running on exactly this issue, isn't he, at the moment?
Yeah.
He keeps on coming back to the fact that other countries are emptying their prisons and coming across the southern border as an invasion. So,
I'm sure it doesn't need saying to the audience of this show, but like when you hear refugee, should not think of someone in need. You should think of someone who even in shithole countries, is not welcome. That's generally what refugees are.
I mean, you just got to think of the logistics of it. How do they afford the massive fee that it takes to go? It's not easy. Especially coming to this country, because you've got to cross a sea, right? And there's all sorts of people who have to be paid off in between. I think the price tag's something like 10 grand.
And how do they come into contact with all these supposedly merciless criminal gangs? They're just all part of one network. They're criminals themselves.
Zawahiri. He was the leader of a radical faction from Egypt called Islamic Jihad, and he was convinced that they, not the moderates, were the true Islamists.
We are here. We are here. The real Islamic Front. We are here. The real Islamic Front and the real Islamic opposition against Zionism. We are here. The real Islamic Front against Zionism, communism and imperialism.
Ayman Zawahiri was a follower of the Egyptian revolutionary Said Qutb, who had been executed in 1966.
Of last week fame. So if you haven't seen last week's, that was all about him. Fascinating, really.
Last week's programme showed Qutb believed that the liberal ideas in Western societies corrupted the minds of Muslims because they unleashed the most selfish aspects of human nature. Zawahiri had interpreted Qutb's theories to mean that this corruption included the Western system of democracy. Democracy, Zawahiri believed, encouraged politicians to set themselves up as the source of all authority, and by doing this, they were rejecting the higher authority of the Quran. This meant they were no longer true Muslims, and so they and those who supported them could legitimately be killed. The terror this created, he said, would shock the masses into seeing the truth behind the corrupt facade of democracy.
When the Egyptians, the jihadi group, came from Egypt with their own explanation, with their own ideas, that anybody participate in any parliament or any political party or going to elect or call people for the election and sort of these activities is totally rejecting the Quran. So when you say that, it means when a Muslim rejecting the Quran simply must be killed. He should be killed, must be killed. And that's what happened.
Zawahiri and his small group settled in Peshawar. They began to spread this new idea among the foreign fighters, radicalizing the Islamist movement. It was not only a direct challenge to the moderate ideas of Abdullah Azzam, but it also involved a militant rejection of all American influence over the jihad, because America was the source of this corruption.
The only times that I ever ran into any real trouble in Afghanistan was when I ran into these guys. It would be kind of a moment or two that would look a little bit like the bar scene in Star Wars. You're just kind of each group kind of jockeying around, and finally somebody has to sort of defuse the situation.
Не горят сигнальные лампы. Попрошу отрегулировать. Президент СССР Михаил Сергеевич Горбачев издал указ.
Then, in 1987, the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev decided he was going to withdraw Russian troops from Afghanistan. Gorbachev was convinced that the whole Soviet system was facing collapse. He was determined to try and save it through political reform, and this meant reversing the policies of his predecessors, including the occupation of Afghanistan.
Just a quick question on Gorbachev. Horus, I've often wondered, was Gorbachev secretly working for the West like all along? Because he just, I mean, it's not that far-fetched, is it? Because his actions, I mean, there's scenarios in which the Soviet Union could have kept going, but he chose.
No, I disagree. I think my understanding of it, maybe this is a very mainstream view, but Gorbachev was put in place by the Central Committee. I think, well, the Supreme Presidium of it or whatever, because even amongst a lot of the hardliners, not all of them, sort of Soviet, sort of communist fundamentalists, like even some of them just conceded that the system is not working, that we are approaching, complete collapse of some kind, or some sort of breakage. I mean, they wouldn't have acknowledged that communism was fundamentally flawed, but they knew that something was wrong, that things weren't working. And he was brought in as a reformer, by the Politburo. It wasn't just by, was it Chernenko or Andropov? One of the two. I think Chernenko was the immediate predecessor, but he was only in place for less than a year, or just about a year. But Gorbachev was brought in because there was a recognition amongst the rulership of the party in general that they had big problems and some sort of new ideas were needed. And the reason why they recognized that was because it was undeniable, because communism was just failing. It was just does not work. I completely reject the idea that communism could have lasted maybe an extra, I don't know, 10 years, maybe, I don't know, but it was bound for collapse.
It was sort of comically obvious at the time. I sort of remember that after Brezhnev, there was this succession of leaders like, as you say, Andropov, Chernenko, I think Shevardnadze, perhaps at one point, and
no, he was foreign minister under Gorbachev.
Was he foreign? I thought he deputized as the leader for a while. My mistake. But certainly there was this joke of them sort of being so short lived. As soon as one got in, the next week you'd be seeing him stiff as a board in a coffin with red roses around him because they popped off at some rate
or something. Gerontocracy or something.
Yeah. But I could see AA's point there. You could sort of get the impression, because I remember about this time, they really, AA, you've said in the past, you look at the media and what they want you to notice,
Yes.
how emphatic they are. And I remember quite clearly, and this is something that was quite imprinted on me, because I don't know why, but when Gorbachev came along, there was a big drive to kind of announce him, if you like, in the media. And the main things that they did was they associated these two Russian words with him, glasnost and perestroika. That Gorbachev was going to bring glasnost, which was going to be about sort of openness, and perestroika, which was going to be about the sort of remaking of the Russian system. So it was kind of very sort of heavily hammered. But as Horace says as well, there's, Peter Hitchens has talked about this experience of being in the late Soviet Union, watching a particular film in a cinema with people, and they're all kind of crying because they recognize the condition of the Soviet Union. Like Gorbachev says here, they're all saying we can't go on like this. So it does seem like it was a kind of last desperate throw of the dice.
I always remember him being presented to us as a hero.
Yeah, exactly.
And being like the one kind of Russian that was kind of encouraged for you. You were kind of encouraged to like him in some ways. I mean, I have to say the reason I mention that is because there's this game called Crisis in the Kremlin, where you take over in 1985 in the game, and the aim of the game is to save the Soviet Union. And I have managed to, I've never quite not been ousted from power at some point, but I have got them past 1991 in the past, and I've done it by going all out Stalinist every time. Like rejecting, like usually using force and playing hard Stalinist. That's the only way I've found to have any success, because if you go the Gorbachev route, you basically history ends up playing out the way it did. So
to concede a couple of things to what you said, I do believe that the American or the Western media and politicians like obviously Thatcher were pleased and encouraged Gorbachev to be seen as the leader, because there was some question at first. I think he sort of emerged before Chernenko died, I think, but there were other contenders like when Khrushchev took over as well. I'm sure the Western media would have played him up. Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, we
And
can do business with him, wasn't it? That's what she said.
right. She specifically reached out to him, and that helped Reagan form a relationship with him as well. The other thing was, though, as well, I do think Gorbachev probably hastened the end, because restructuring perestroika like that could only that could only hasten the end. Like in the Czech Spring, was it 68?
Yeah.
1968. The Soviets were right to crack down on it in a sense, in that. So the Czechs were trying to sort of lift the lid. I think Miloš Forman described it as lifting the lid, like the pressure cooker, because the pressure was too, maybe not pressure cooker, but the pan was going to burst its own lid. But as soon as you lift the lid, people just immediately start attacking the regime at its fundamentals, right? And start questioning communism and Marxism themselves, which of course they do, because some large part of the population is against it.
Well, that's the funny story about
and they couldn't
Gorbachev.
cope with it. They couldn't handle it. They had to just crack down again. That's the only solution.
Yeah,
and Gorbachev basically had, he arrived when it was too late even for that.
Yeah, that was the funny thing about Gorbachev, wasn't it? Because he started holding elections for the people's deputies, and it just ended up with people coming in and scratching off the Communist Party representative off the ballot paper.
Yeah, and then obviously he was faced with the other countries towards sort of 88, I think 89. The other countries started. I think Hungary was the most sort of liberal of them. Started saying, like, we want to actually have a multi-party election, and Gorbachev was the first leader who had been approached with that, but also the first one who would say, okay, that's your affair. Well, that is the end of the Warsaw Pact. That is the end of the Soviet bloc. As soon as they did, when Poland was the same, they had elections, and I think 99% of the vote immediately went to anti-communist candidates, right? Mm-hmm. So he was just kind of, you could say, a tragic figure. Like, he wanted to hold communism together.
But,
but it's impossible.
In that game I was talking about, Horus, all those events actually happen. And, my response, as opposed to Gorbachev's response, is deny the elections, bring in the army, crack down every time.
Yeah.
But and that works in that game. You're just using force and, re-centralizing power, re-Stalinizing. It does, like, you can actually save the Soviet Union in that game going that route. But you cannot do it doing the Gorbachev route, because Gorbachev's route literally is weakening the Soviet Union. It decentralizes power, and how can I put it? It's like you're basically giving up power to your enemies all the time.
Yeah.
Because he's buying into stupid ideas like democracy, for example. Anyway, let's carry on.
The state of the Soviet Union and its society could be described very simply with a phrase used by people across the country. We can't go on living like this any longer. That applied to everything. The economy was stagnating, there were shortages, and the quality of goods was very poor. We had to finish this war, but in such a way that the Russian people would understand why tens of thousands had died. We couldn't just run away from there in shame. No. We needed to find a process.
Gorbachev asked the Americans to help him negotiate.
Just to say that's an important point there. I made a tweet about this last night after that young reform guy talked about, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And I said, the reality is we always negotiate with terrorists. There's the top line narrative that you sell to people that, we're the tough guys, we're going to go in and we're going to take no compromises. But the reality is the backroom of government does have to do things like that. And what Gorbachev's describing there is this sort of process of face saving that has to happen. You take an example like the IRA, back as far back as the early 70s, there was a determination actually to sort of end the conflict because it was stalemated. The British security forces had sort of managed to tie the IRA down. And obviously there was a ferocity of struggle and if you like, an emphasis about, Republican politics that really imprinted itself on the public mind. But in reality, the IRA did meet with MI6, through go-betweens to say, look, let's try and find a way to bring this to an end. And obviously it took, another 25 odd years before the Good Friday Agreement came along. But there was negotiation throughout in order to make that political transition stick, if you like, because at the elite level, they kind of know it's like civil wars. People do just become worn out and they have to find a way to escape. And it does happen by negotiation with governments.
Yeah, and I mean, even Iran and America are in back-channel communications, and that has actually been one of the stories of this past week, where apparently there was a back-channel communication to the Iranians. There was kind of a deal that they had, where you don't hit Israeli leaders, and we don't assassinate Hezbollah leaders or whatever. And there was a kind of tacit agreement that America had given Iran assurances that wouldn't happen, but then the Israelis went ahead and did it anyway. So one of the things that's happening at the moment is that deals that have been made in those back channels are being reneged on in real time, i.e. they're lying, they're breaking the rules of even informal back channel diplomacy at this point, which apparently is just not done, so they're crossing a lot of lines at the moment, the Israelis. But even now, at the point, to your point, Simon, even now, these powers who seem to be great enemies are actually in touch with each other.
You've got to be aware of sort of sputtering bluster, such as we see on some channels in our media, that, the plucky Brits are going to stand up to terrorism and all this stuff. Well, I mean, I'm not saying I approve of these people that we're dealing with. What I'm saying is the political realities are that that's a line for you, the marks. That's not how it's operating backstage.
A peace that would create a stable government in Afghanistan. But the hardliners in Washington refused point blank. They would continue to help the Mujahideen until the last Russians left, without any negotiation. The future of Afghanistan would then be decided, they said, by the freedom fighters.
I think that basically we've asked the United States, help us get out if you're really interested in stopping the bloodshed.
But can you get out and leave a government in Afghanistan that supports, that is a friend of the Soviet Union's?
I believe that we can get out, provided that indeed no more aid is given to what people here call freedom fighters and what we call counter-revolutionaries. I believe that's possible, provided that the United States is also interested in the same.
Well, it's not very complicated. They arrived in a matter of...
Was that Peter Snow, by the way, or was that a young Jon Snow?
It's Peter Snow.
It sounded a lot like Jon Snow, but it looked like Peter Snow.
It's Peter Snow. He's been around forever. Yeah.
I'm assuming he's long retired now, Peter Snow. But okay. But I don't recall him doing anything like that in the studio. He was usually the man who did the swingometer, wasn't he? I don't recall him in a studio-based role, so that was interesting to see.
Days on Christmas Eve in 1979, they could be home by Christmas Eve if they decided to leave Afghanistan and let the Afghans decide their own future. If you leave, the problem of support to the Mujahideen solves itself.
Gorbachev was shocked by the intransigence of the US administration. He sent a private message through the KGB warning the Americans that if they allowed the Mujahideen to take control in Afghanistan, it would not produce democracy. Instead, he predicted, the most extreme forms of Islamism would rise up and triumph. But Gorbachev's warning was ignored. As Soviet troops left Afghanistan, both the Americans and the Islamists came to believe that they had not only won the battle for Afghanistan, they had also begun the downfall of the entire evil empire.
I felt we won because I was part of it. I'm sure that the Afghan Arabs felt we won. And then all summer long, the East Germans began to gather, 100 here, 1,000, tens of thousands, until November 9th, and the wall was opened, and that's it. Start the clock running on the Soviet Union, and it was over. The Soviet Union was all cracked up and broken, and that was done.
Is it possible that it had nothing to do with Afghanistan whatsoever? By the way, the fall of the Soviet Union, that neither of these two things precipitated the fall. Or
That's what Curtis is going to go on to say. Yeah, that the sort of inherent contradictions and inefficiencies of the Soviet system just led it to rot from within and collapse.
Yeah, I think it was on its path, and then Afghanistan war exacerbated it. Obviously, costly, demoralizing, made them look bad, made them look inhumane because there was a lot of killing of civilians and stuff, and just exacerbated what was already happening. I think. By the way, Peter Snow was apparently the presenter of Newsnight from its founding in 1980 until 97.
I didn't know that until 1997.
So says Wikipedia.
It was Paxo. I remember Paxman presenting it.
You know, Peter Snow is the reason why Dan Snow is on TV as well. Right?
I do, yeah.
There's no other reason.
Yeah, Paxo was the central anchor man, yeah. But I know Peter. I had seen Peter Snow as on presenting duties at that time. You know, I think I don't know if I'm right on this, but I think Newsnight developed from a program in the 70s called Nationwide that I seem to remember, where it was kind of like a few key presenters interviewing panels, and Newsnight developed out of that.
Interesting. I honestly didn't. I don't. Those two things don't go together in my mind because I associate Peter Snow so much more with election night, basically. But it makes sense, I guess. Because election night is only once every 5 years or something. So you have to have a day job.
David Dimbleby was the anchor for election night, wasn't he? But I suppose he was on a whole variety of other programs as well.
Yeah. Well, he was the Question Time presenter and various other things, I guess. But
and he did An Ocean Apart, didn't he?
And of course, yes, An Ocean Apart, his finest work. He wrote the book. He wrote the book of Oceans Apart, which I have here, with David Reynolds.
Someone needs to talk to Dimbleby.
So David Reynolds is another favourite of the BBC as well, isn't he?
Yeah, as a favorite. I mean, David Reynolds, a much better historian than Dan Snow, it has to be said. So.
Like, Dan Snow does not count as a historian. It's the one thing he's got right is that he refers to himself as a history guy rather than a historian. That is fair, because he is not up to the tag historian.
I'm not a fan of Dan Snow either.
I can't. He's a piece of crap.
No.
For the neoconservatives, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a triumph. And out of that triumph was going to come the central myth that still inspires them today, that through the aggressive use of American power, they could transform the world and spread democracy. But in reality, their victory was an illusion. They had conquered a phantom enemy, an exaggerated and distorted fantasy they had created in their own minds. The real reason the Soviet Union collapsed was because it was a decrepit system, decaying from within.
I think probably one of the greatest myths in American political discourse right now, is that actions of the American government were responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed like a house of cards because it was a house of cards. It rotted away from within. The economy was rotten. The political process was rotten. They had developed a central government that was no longer believed by people outside of Moscow. There was total cynicism throughout the Soviet system.
Does that sound familiar to anyone, by the way?
So it was an important question what you raised, actually. Yeah, because I would say that the system was collapsing anyway, but this allowed the neocons to take credit for it. And that has been important ever since, right? That gave them a lot of credibility that they've used since then.
Yeah, I'm also suggesting, by the way, that the conditions that were being felt in late Soviet society are being felt in our own societies right now, because nobody trusts the government anymore. Trusting the institutions is an all-time low.
Pessimism as well.
Pessimism and cynicism runs rampant. It's kind of we do have the kind of whiff of late Soviet.
But we don't have a Gorbachev.
Well, I do remember that I think it was Morgoth wrote an essay suggesting that Trump could be a Gorbachev. Trump actually could be the American Gorbachev. You know, trying to save the system by reforming it in some way. And it's interesting that Farage is called his party reform, you know.
Right. And talks about integration, which is surely just impossible now, you know. It's just, yeah, these dreams of saving the system as it is, of avoiding fundamental change. Yeah,
of governance.
There was no real civil society. But the Reagan administration and the minions of the Reagan administration will tell you that Afghanistan led to a collapse of the Soviet Union itself, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the East European Empire. We were saying that this was entirely fanciful, and the United States missed all of this because they believed their own myths and their own fanciful notions. They had become their own victims of their own lies.
And for the Islamists too, a great myth was born out of the struggle in Afghanistan, that it was they who had conquered the Soviet Union. The Islamists believed that this great victory would start a revolution that would sweep across the Arab world and topple the corrupt leaders. But as with the neoconservatives, this dream was built on an illusion.
The Islamists were convinced that they were the key instrument in the demise of the Soviet army in Afghanistan. They just would not like to remember that without US military help and training, they couldn't have done anything, and also that the Afghans were the ones who ousted the Soviets, not the Arab jihadis who didn't really fight. They were trained, but they were not the fighters. But the myth has it that they were the ones who won. I mean, this was jihad that had triumphed. This was something very powerful that was a mobilizing force for Islamists worldwide.
But there was a deep rift within the Islamist fighters based in Peshawar, between the moderates, led by Abdullah Azzam, who believed this revolution could be accomplished politically, and the extremists, like Ayman Zawahiri, who saw violent revolution as the only way. And Zawahiri now set out to extend his influence over the movement and to undermine Abdullah Azzam. To do this, he seduced Osama bin Laden and his money away from Azzam. He promised bin Laden that he could become the emir, the leader of Zawahiri's small extremist group, Islamic Jihad.
Ayman Zawahiri and another group of Egyptians, they refused to pray behind Abdullah Azzam in Peshawar. They use to create rumors in Peshawar against Abdullah Azzam. That's why we became angry about Osama, why he closed these people to him. They accepted him as an emir, and he accepted them as a group. Finally, I don't know who did use the other.
What do you think?
I think the other used him.
Because he had the money?
Yes.
Then, at the end of 1989, Abdullah Azzam was assassinated by a huge car bomb in Peshawar. It is still unknown who carried out the assassination. But despite his death, it seemed as if Azzam's vision of a political revolution might prevail. In the early 90s, in countries across the Arab world, Islamist parties began to gather mass support. In Algeria, the Islamic Salvation Front won overwhelming victories in local elections and looked certain to win the coming general election. And at the same time in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood began to win mass support and a growing number of seats in parliament. Both parties were riding to power on an idealistic vision. They would use Islam in a political way to create a new type of model society through peaceful means.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry, do you think it's fair to say that bin Laden is one of the few genuine cases of LARP it until you make it? That he started off basically as a kind of rich kid LARPer, but by the end he literally was the kind of emir, warlord leader living in a cave that he set out to be, type thing.
It's interesting that he was poached away from the political path towards the militant path, like it's being described here, from away from Azzam towards Zawahiri. I mean, it must be one of the biggest examples of, disgruntled former employee who goes off, and the consequences of that. But yes, as you say, it sort of maybe that speaks to a bit of, bored naivety on his part.
Well, I always remember footage. It always stuck with me when the fatwa was put on Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie got obsessed with playing Nintendo games because he was stuck indoors. So I always remember this news story of Salman Rushdie playing Super Mario World. Okay. But then I swear that I have also seen footage of, well, apparently Osama bin Laden living in the cave or whatever started getting bored, and he got into Nintendo, and there was footage of like literally Osama bin Laden playing video games. I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
Okay?
It's true.
And so there's always this odd post-modern element of bin Laden where he's actually just like a modern rich guy who is LARPing as this kind of religious fundamentalist leader, but also he was that as well. He actually became it. He overcame Baudrillard. Nothing ever happens, but in fact, it did happen. He did make it happen. Baudrillard.
So much trouble caused by incels in bedrooms.
There's loads and loads of contradictory stories about bin Laden. There's two that I'd mentioned in particular. One was a year or so, I think, or a few months before the September 11th attacks, from the French newspaper Le Figaro, leftist but mainstream, I think. They reported that he met two CIA agents in Dubai, I think, somewhere like Dubai, like a rich place. And there's also an interview with a Pakistani newspaper from a few months after September 11th, where he said, that wasn't us. Like, we wouldn't target civilians. I mean, that might be made up. I don't know, but because there was also those attacks in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, I think, in the couple of years before. Although, I don't know, did bin Laden really claim credit for them? I'm not sure. It's just there's a lot of smoke around this character. Like, I could well believe that he's half of what he was said to be. He definitely was this rich guy who contributed to these causes, but somewhat led along by others. But the idea of him as the evil mastermind who set out to, overthrow even the Saudi government, which was said of him, I think a lot of that is made up. There's a lot of fake bin Ladens, like, in JFK they created fake Lee Harvey Oswalds as well.
Bin Laden's just a patsy.
One of my most controversial opinions, by the way, and I'll repeat it just to trigger everybody, is that I'm probably like the only person on earth who I say the only person on earth, me and like BBC journalists, I just believe the official story of 9/11. Every time I've said this, everybody goes absolutely crazy, but I'm just
after Curto, we can do a series. We can watch all the documentaries about revisionist documentaries.
I don't think we're allowed to do that on YouTube. Still,
okay, right. Over to Rumble for that. All right.
Watch 5-hour Ryan Dawson documentaries. Yeah.
I don't know. I just believe the official story. But anyway, let's carry on. I'm not even saying that as a line. It's one of my few, that and JFK are my two big ones where I trigger all the boomers, where I'm just like, I believe the official story.
Well, I mean, on a serious note, that's kind of one of the major themes for Curtis. It's the sort of circumstantialism of this stuff, that people are kind of conveniently triangulated to be in places, and at the same time, certain qualities are reduced to them, like the idea that these guys are running big, complex organizations, but it's all a fantasy, essentially. It's a projection by other elements of power elites in order to make a convenient narrative on top, rather than these people being the engineers of these things to a maximalist degree. Let's say they maybe have agency in some sense, but in another sense, they are just kind of convenient, pegs to hang some clothes on.
I will say on the JFK front, I did watch something. I can't remember if it was a Devon Stack video or something else. Maybe something on Judge Knapp's channel where they started talking about JFK. But I did come across something that actually shook my belief in the official narrative, which was actually the idea that I don't want to get too sidetracked on JFK because it's a huge topic, but actually that the the official story was a double cover-up, if that makes any sense. So all of this stuff about LBJ scrambling to try to de-escalate with the Russians because, you know, the shooter had like communist and Russian sympathies. That was the official cover story, and that was a genuine cover-up. But there was a double internal cover-up because it really wasn't the Russians who were behind it. It was really another, you know, our favorite country in the Middle East that was behind it. And this was kept even from like top officials within the US national apparatus. I believe that one more. I can see that being plausible, given some of the other things, but I cannot remember where I saw that now. But you know, that is the only thing that has made me think, oh, maybe, because then the propagation of the conspiracy makes more sense. Because the thing I'm always skeptical of, Horus, is when conspiracies are mainstreamed and like JFK's had like films made about it, right? It's
JFK the movie is executive produced by Arnon Milchan, who is a known Israeli agent in Hollywood.
And so that is the if it really was a double cover-up and the real people behind it were our friends in the Middle East there, that explains why the conspiracy theory is mainstreamed, because it's a kind of, you know, it actually gets you further away from what actually happened, you know. Anyway, let's carry on.
نحن نستطيع أن نغير الشعب بالتربية والتوعية وبالاقتناع وبناء قاعدة شعبية تؤمن بالمبادئ التي ندعو إليها وهذا هو الطريق الناجح والسليم.
This man needs to read The Populist Delusion.
I was going to say, this is flying in the face of elite theory. This.
Not for the first time, these Islamists have got basic power politics wrong.
لا نريد ثورة، لا نريد انقلاب عسكري، لا نريد عنف، لا نريد قوة. نحن نريد حقنا الطبيعي في أن ندعو الناس إلى ما نؤمن به. فإن آمن الناس فاستعمل الحكومة قطعا على الاستجابة ورغبتهم.
But the governments in both Egypt and Algeria faced a terrible dilemma. At the heart of the Islamist vision was the idea that the Quran should be used as the political framework for the society, an absolute set of laws beyond debate that all politicians had to follow. The implication of this was that political parties would be irrelevant because there could be no disagreement. The people were about to vote in parties that might use their power to end democracy.
C'est un dilemme. Comment trouver une autre solution pour arrêter le processus électoral et dire il n'y aura pas de deuxième tour? Fallait-il laisser arriver au pouvoir un parti qui vous disait oui, un homme, une voix, mais une seule fois? On n'ira pas aux élections après parce que la démocratie est coffre, elle est impie. Lorsque nous serons au pouvoir, nous y resterons pour l'éternité parce que c'est nous qui sommes les détenteurs de la vérité religieuse et c'est nous qui appliquerons le Coran.
Faced by this dilemma, in Algeria, the army decided to step in. And in June 1991, they staged a coup d'etat and immediately cancelled the elections. Mass protests by the Islamists were repressed violently and their leaders arrested. At the same time in Egypt, the government also clamped down. They arrested hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood members and banned the organisation from any political activity.
What happened is a wave of arresting Muslim brothers, a wave of military court for Muslim brothers, going to kill some of Muslim brothers under torture. They stopped all the free elections in all of the society institution. And this wave and this manner, you open the doors of hell for the violent groups who were hidden underground, and it stopped the moderates, opens the door for the violence.
Pause a second.
For Ayman Zawahiri, this
is just something that I picked up on last week that just seems worth mentioning again. Just this is under Hosni Mubarak right now. Like Sadat was killed in the late 70s, early 80s. So this is under Hosni Mubarak, who was in power until the Arab Spring of 2011. And then there was elections in Egypt in 2011, which the Muslim Brotherhood won, and then the military just basically overthrew them, executed loads of them, put them in prison. And it seems to be the same story in Egypt. It's like, no, you're not, because democracy will go towards Islam, towards Islamism, and they're just not having it. And it sort of makes sense of why Ayman Zawahiri earlier was saying we are against communism, imperialism, and Zionism, because it is partly Zionism that determines what kind of government Egypt gets, which I can well see how that's outrageous. It's just one point of sympathy with the Islamists there, I guess. Like, you're promised democracy, and then it goes the wrong way, and then you all just get executed.
This was a dramatic confirmation of his belief that the Western system of democracy was a corrupt sham. Groups of radical Islamists who had developed his theories in even more extreme forms now set out to create violent revolutions in Algeria and Egypt. It would be the start of a jihad that would liberate the Muslim world from corruption.
وهذه المذلة وهذا الكفر الذي قد طغى وعم على أرض الإسلام لا سبيل لدكه إلا بالجهاد وإلا بالرصاص وإلا بالعمليات الاستشهادية.
Bin Laden and the others started from now on to wage their own jihad, i.e. Not to compromise, not to try to compromise with more moderate groups, but thinking that an armed vanguard would be able to implement the seizing of power. They were convinced that they could duplicate the Afghan victory, or quote-unquote victory, that they could establish an Islamist state in Algeria, in Egypt, and the like. They thought that was capture the hearts and minds of the Muslim masses, that people would realize that strength and victory were on the side of the jihadis.
At this same time, in Washington, the other group who believed that they had brought down the Soviet Union, the neoconservatives, were also determined to push on with their revolutionary agenda. They were convinced that the Soviet Union was just one of many evil regimes in the world, led by tyrants, that threatened America. Regimes they had to conquer to liberate the world and spread democracy.
We want, down with tyranny. We want free countries. We think that America's better off if we live in a world primarily populated with free countries who have to appeal to their own people for the source of their power and to ratify their decisions.
Well, they did back then. I don't know if they still believe that now.
This is one thing I'd really criticise about Curtis, is that he does say they believed and they were convinced of these things. I don't think he has any basis for saying that. They used these things. They said these things.
Yeah, I mean, Ledeen is in opposition to Jack Wheeler at the beginning, who has sort of got a quality of the heroic about him. Ledeen is one of the sort of nastiest figures in this. He describes himself as an ultra neoconservative. I mean, just look at the masks behind him. To the left, Darth Vader. To the right,
I noticed that.
Sort of, I mean, masks is probably Curtis framing a very good sort of visual metaphor there. There's interesting stuff about Ledeen in there as well. That this is from an article by one Jonah Goldberg called Baghdad Delenda Est from 2002, and he says, "I've long been an admirer of, if not a fully fledged subscriber to, what I call the Ledeen doctrine. I'm not sure my friend Michael Ledeen will thank me for ascribing authorship to him, and he may have only been semi-serious when he crafted it, but here is the bedrock tenet of the Ledeen doctrine in more or less his own words. Quote, every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up some crappy little small country and throw it against the wall just to show the world we mean business."
More like it.
He did his PhD in Italian fascism, apparently. And, quote, he believed that despite the bad name Mussolini gave to fascism, there were plenty of good fascist ideas that were worth salvaging. Mussolini's theory is alleged of creative destruction. I always thought that was Schumpeter, but apparently Mussolini had a theory of creative destruction, which holds that sweeping away the old order through violence is the only way for society to progress. Change, above all violent change, is the essence of human history, wrote Ledeen. in his book Machiavelli on Modern Leadership. So as Horace says, he is a kind of covert in his enjoyment.
And you know, the name neoconservative is just nonsense. They're not conservative in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. It's like a form of containment where you try to appear, you know, incredibly hard, much more hard than the normal center. But that allows you then to justify these methods.
Kind of remarkable that he wrote those things, though. And it didn't like end his career, for example. Or,
those are not pseudo quotes. Yeah, that was in the early 70s when he did his PhD. But yeah, he's been pretty out there.
And Jonah Goldberg, quoting that approvingly. He was big at the National Review, wasn't he? National Review
and a massive Never Trump cuck, basically.
Yeah.
Well,
and National Review got rid of people like Joseph Sobran and probably St. Francis as well, right? But they kept people like Jonah Goldberg, who wrote one of the worst books I've ever read, Liberal Fascism. Dreadful.
Terrible.
0 out of 10.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show you what a meritocratic world we live in, where Jonah Goldberg is the best conservative writer in America, so he gets to have a 30-year career writing for National Review. You know.
But again, that metaphor of the masks there, you know, because Ledine's top line is the urgency of combating centralized state power and the centrality of human freedom.
You know, when you have the skill and talent of somebody like Jonah Goldberg, high verbal IQ, you know, it's definitely merit and not some other factor that is you know, making people like Goldberg dominate these institutions. But anyway, let's carry on.
And we think that if the whole world were like that, then we would be much more secure, and that typically we are attacked by tyrants. I think it's America's destiny, because I think America's always going to come under attack from tyrants. So I think that our only choice is whether we're going to win or lose, and when we will fight and under what circumstances. But that we're going to have to fight, that's automatic, because they're going to come after us.
One of the most evil of these tyrants, the neoconservatives decided, was Saddam Hussein. In the 1980s, Saddam had been America's close ally, but in 1990, he invaded Kuwait. The neoconservatives now saw him as a key to pursuing the next stage of their transformation of the world. An American-led coalition had been created by President Bush Sr. to liberate Kuwait. But the neoconservatives, like Paul Wolfowitz, who was Under Secretary of Defense, wanted to push on to Baghdad and bring about a transformation of the Middle East. It would fulfill America's unique role to defeat evil in the world.
You see already in 91 the hopes of Wolfowitz and others that the battle against Saddam Hussein or other petty tyrants could take the place of the battle against the Soviet Union and could bear this interpretation of a battle between good and evil. So what you're seeing is the attempt to keep alive the idea that America is engaged in a battle of pure good against pure evil, and to preserve that framework for a world after the end of the Soviet Union.
But President Reagan was no longer in charge. The neoconservatives now had a leader who did not share their vision.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. I am pleased to announce all United States and coalition forces.
Now, I always find it interesting that George H.W. Bush, despite his long deep state ties and being a CIA man and all the rest of it, did not actually share that vision. And in fact, you find some surprising people on our side of things who generally have some respect for George H.W. Bush. I find that kind of interesting, and that Curtis is acknowledging that somewhat here.
Older George Bush was just more moderate and more realistic, and more of the realist school, I think.
Well, they say that he is the last of the old kind of, I guess you'd say, WASP aristocracy in America. They're like the final back when they had a competent elite. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of the commentators who are around now, like I mentioned, Judge Napolitano, Douglas McGregor is someone with a big following now. Of course, he was a commander under George H.W. Bush. It was that administration. But it seems like after Bush Senior, that's where you get the real kind of neoconization of all of American politics, basically.
It's possibly also a reaction to Bill Casey, the CIA chief who we saw earlier, who possibly left a bit of a bad taste in the mouths of the American sort of Beltway elite, because he was much more of a kind of rough and ready sort of character. We saw, I think, last week how he was kind of fooled by the sort of the CIA's own black ops propaganda, took him in. Into a sort of, I mean, they called him a romantic, really, that he was sort of taken in by this idea of fighting the evil empire. But he himself was sort of quite a sketchy character in many ways. He'd been an OSS agent runner during the war, venture capitalist. He was a tax lawyer. He invented the tax shelter. So you can see why such a person would be useful to the CIA in its earlier incarnation as quite a ruthless displacer of governments and needing to invent front companies to do all the kind of work it did around the world. And Casey, I think, was thought of as a bit fast and loose, and he ran his own private intelligence operations as well, so he sort of romanticized. There's a quote from him. He sort of compared lawyers and intelligence gatherers and talked about confronting the paradox of being seekers of truth and partisans. I mean, it's just kind of an elegant way of saying that lawyers and spies just sort of tell lies while aiming to be heroes, and yet George Herbert Walker Bush comes along and puts a more restrained and sort of statesman-like front on American. After things like Iran-Contra, have kind of soured people's sense of America's, let's say, ethical underpinning, during the 80s.
Will suspend combat operations.
Once Kuwait was freed, Bush ordered the fighting to stop. His view was that America's role was to create stability in the world, not to try and change it. Like Henry Kissinger, who had been the enemy of the neoconservatives in the 1970s, Bush saw questions of good and evil as irrelevant. The higher aim was to achieve a stable balance of power in the Middle East.
Saddam Hussein is not a threat to his neighbors. He's a nuisance, he's an annoyance, but he's not a threat. That we achieved. It was never our objective to get Saddam Hussein. Indeed, had we tried, we still might be occupying Baghdad. That would have turned a great success into a very messy, probable defeat.
In private, the neoconservatives, like Paul Wolfowitz, were furious. Not just because Saddam Hussein had been left in power, but because they saw this as a clear expression of the corrupt liberal values that dominated America. A moral relativism that was prepared to compromise with the forces of evil in the world.
Wolfowitz's anger is fundamentally an anger against the weakness of American liberalism, the compromising nature of a man like George Bush Sr., his willingness to make concessions, to negotiate, not to drive to the bitter end. And his anger is motivated, interestingly, less by hatred of Saddam Hussein than by hatred of American liberals, who are a source of weakness and a source of rot and a source of relativism that have been corroding American society for decades.
Faced by this defeat, the neoconservative movement now turned inwards to try and defeat the forces of liberalism that were holding it back.
See, this is curiously confusing, though, because as you were talking about earlier on, Horace, there's nothing conservative about the neocons, right? Their disgust with the liberals basically is that they weren't prepared to kind of be radical enough, right? I mean, it's being framed as a kind of conservative reaction. against liberal values, but actually it's like you're not being Schmittian enough. You're not absolute enough. It's kind of in the name of liberal democracy, basically. They're not radical.
They completely agree with the liberals when it suits them, like on immigration. Obviously, they exceed them. As I said last week, I read a couple of quotes last week from typical neoconservatives. Their attitude towards immigration is maximize it into America, not into Israel. And they are liberals themselves on whatever issues they want. It's not a genuine opposition to liberals or liberalism at all. It's nonsense. Curtis doesn't seem to be able to handle some of these complexities or something. I'm not sure. I wanted to pick up on something just a bit with Brent Scowcroft a bit ago. I think he was a senior military man, wasn't he? But he said there in 1996, like if we had occupied Baghdad, we'd still be there, 5 years on. This documentary was made in 2004, right? 1 year after the second invasion of Iraq. Obviously, nobody making this knew that America was still in some ways going to be in Baghdad. I don't know, even now. I don't know. When did American forces eventually leave Iraq? I'm not sure. But or have they all left? I'm not sure. There's probably still special forces there. Obviously, the ISIS happened about 10 years ago as well. But the neocons, they just wouldn't care about that. They just doesn't matter. Yeah, that's just American troops. Like they don't have any fundamental loyalty to America or to America's troops or they don't care about the costs, the trillions of dollar costs. They just believe that things will work out fine for them, think like it will be us who's in charge. So we'll just ride the tiger, you could say. We'll ride, we'll ride out the chaos that will come. It's fine. It's just not a problem. It's someone else's problem.
And to do this, they turned again to the theories of Leo Strauss. Strauss believed that good politicians should reassert the absolute moral values that would unite society, and this would overcome the moral relativism that liberalism created. One of the most influential Straussians was the new assistant to the vice president, William Crystal.
For Strauss, liberalism had produced a decent way of life and one that he thought was worth defending. But a dead end of where nothing could be said to be true, one had no guidance on how to live, everything was relative. Strauss suggested that maybe that we didn't just have to sit there and accept that that was our fate, that politics could help shape the way people live, teach them some good lessons about living decent and noble human lives. And can we think about what cultures and what politics, what social orders produce more admirable human beings? I mean, that whole question was put back on the table by Strauss, I think.
Pause a second.
The neoconservatives set out to reform America.
Just picking up on, it just said Bill Crystal was chief of staff to the vice president during George Bush Sr.'s time. So even George Bush carried over these neocons, right? The vice president, was it Dan Quayle, the famously stupid Dan Quayle? So like even his administration was still riddled with these guys.
And at the heart of their project was the political use of religion. Together with their long-term allies, the religious right, they began a campaign to bring moral and religious issues back into the center of conservative politics. It became known as the Culture Wars.
Your tax dollars are being used to sponsor obscene and pornographic displays.
I don't like Jesus Christ, who is my Lord and Savior, being dunked in a vat of urine by a homosexual and then have my money to pay for it. I think that's obscene.
Satan, be gone! Out from this moment on! Come on!
For the religious right, this campaign was a genuine attempt to renew the religious basis of American society. But for the neoconservatives, religion was a myth, like the myth of America as a unique nation that they had promoted in the Cold War. Strauss had...
But I hope people can see, at the moment, I'm drawing attention all the time, Horace, to what I describe as the slop, being driven by the same people. And it's always the same. It's the culture wars. It's the, they like to activate the evangelicals and, this stuff kind of works on certain type of Americans. But hopefully this documentary is showing why they do that, why they promote these things. I mean, I don't believe for a second that the neocons cared about the the moral sanctity of American life or anything like that. All of that is kind of bollocks. I mean, what they're trying to do is get a base of support for their ploys. Yeah, surely.
Yeah. And Curtis got it right just a second ago. He said, religion was a myth to them, but it was usable. So, yeah.
In the week that you're seeing Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand have a love-in.
Yeah, I mean, Russell Brand and Jordan Peterson leading the Lord's Prayer. I mean, come on, this was like Russell Brand was. I mean, I don't know. I'm not suggesting that they're in bad faith, but bloody hell.
I listened to your office hours yesterday. It was you had some comments on Russell Brand. Now, people should look. Actually, there is actually a podcast Russell Brand did with Adam Curtis. It's slightly uncomfortable at times because Brand is in his kind of motor mouth, cokehead mode. Yes. And he tries to kind of browbeat Adam Curtis because Adam Curtis he's a nice guy, but he's earnestly trying to explain serious concepts, but not solemnly. But you sense Russell Brand is one of those people who, if anybody tries to do something seriously, he's the guy in the room who always has to be undermining it with a joke, if you see what I mean. And Curtis
a comedian, you could say.
Yeah, pathological entertainer, as I call them. Yeah, they kind of are deeply disturbed by somebody trying to explain something real, let's say. And Curtis makes quite a penetrating observation about Brand. He says, "Well, the thing is, Russell, you are the apotheosis of the kind of sort of cult of narcissistic self-expression that we're now trapped in."
Right.
And eventually Brand sort of calms down a bit after that because Curtis sort of keeps it up. I mean, he gets, you could tell Curtis is a bit irritated because Brand is kind of childish and trying to sort of be emollient towards Curtis. But, he actually comes back at him and says, look, you are the sort of, in a sense, the perfect expression of this boomer idea. And,
do you think Curtis's words cut Brand so hard that now this is why he's come to these realizations later in life?
I suspect so. And he does seem to be on a sort of rotating carousel of addictions of, whether it's drugs or sex in the past, but now it's kind of, fads and, whether he's in the sort of conspiracy sphere or another religion. Yeah.
Interesting. I maybe we should review that at some point. When we run out of Andrew Curtis, we should come back to Curtis's encounters with Russell Brand.
If you do the short films, you could make some comments on that podcast. It's quite interesting. It's his Under the Skin podcast, I think. It's on YouTube. I'll put up a link afterwards.
It's from a few years ago, though, right?
A couple of years ago, yeah. I think Adam Curtis has got a soft spot for him, but he's also aware that Brand is just a rampaging egotist and sort of kind of unable to sit still and just calm down.
But you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I feel like the quote unquote MAGA movement and Trumpism has basically just reformed all of this under a different name now. I mean, it's taken them 8 years, to be fair, and it presented them with an issue, and it's not the OG neocons as we talked about earlier on. It's a new set, but essentially they've run the same playbook again, and they've reconstituted the old coalition under a new name. So anyway, maybe I'm too cynical. Not.
Taught that these myths were necessary to give ordinary people meaning and purpose, and so ensure a stable society.
Do you ever worry that they're playing too much Nintendo?
Oh, not anymore. See, Matt has Bible adventures. They're actually learning Bible stories while they're playing Nintendo.
For the neoconservatives, religion is an instrument of promoting morality.
Did you want to pause it? Sorry.
I've got to talk about this. I looked this up. This is a game that was put out in 1991 called Bible Adventures. And it was kind of created unofficially for the Nintendo platform. And it was sort of based around 3 Bible stories, one about, Noah and the Ark, and another one about baby Moses. And it's quite funny. Apparently, the way it's done is very similar in style. You were talking about Super Mario. It was the same style of game as Super Mario Brothers 2.
Right.
And one of the games you're playing Miriam, who is Moses' sister, carrying around baby Moses to protect him from Pharaoh. And apparently, I think in the game, in the Super Mario game, they have they carry vegetables and things like that, and they can sort of throw them around in the air. And apparently, you could sort of throw Moses around in the air. But apparently, there was a glitch in the game where you could actually you could get the character to throw Moses into the Nile. and if you complete that level, the game says, "Good work, but you forgot baby Moses." Apparently, it's been rated one of the worst games of all time.
It sounds terrible. It
Yeah.
sounds absolutely terrible. But anyway, let's carry on. I tell you what, the graphics aren't bad for the time, though. Graphics aren't bad.
I was going to say that. I'd much rather play Crisis in the Kremlin. It sounds much better.
Crisis in the Kremlin, yeah. See if Horus can get a libertarian victory, not a Stalinist victory.
There's quite a good game that time I played called Shadow President, which was you're the US president and you can use all the kind of military, trade, and diplomatic.
Yeah, I played that. Yeah.
Did you? There was a glitch in that game because I had a friend who played it and he showed me it and he said, "Oh, you've got to be quite skillful in what you do with all these different things," and he put me onto the game and I just immediately bombed Russia. And you have a popularity rating, and there was a glitch in the game, and the popularity went up to 800%. And he said, "Oh, that's not right. That's not working." And I said, "It looks fine to me." And then the next day, I bombed China and Cuba, and the popularity went up to 1600%. And then the game crashed.
Gary Garner.
He broke Shadow President.
Yeah, you just do what you think you should.
Gary Garner in the chat says Bin Laden played too much Nintendo.
Very funny. All right, let's finish this.
Religion becomes what Plato called a noble lie. It is a myth which is told to the majority of the society by the philosophical elite in order to ensure social order.
What better way to enjoy God's creation than a praise walk?
So I don't actually disagree with any of that. I would just prefer the elite not to be evil like these ones, you know.
Integrity, music, fitness.
In being a kind of secretive elitist approach, Straussianism does resemble Marxism. These ex-Marxist, or in some cases ex-liberal Straussians, could see themselves as a kind of Leninist group, who have this covert vision, which they want to use to effect change in history, while concealing parts of it from people incapable of understanding it.
Out of this campaign, a new and powerful moral agenda began to take over the Republican Party. It reached a dramatic climax at the Republican Convention in 1992, when the religious right seized control of the party's policy-making machinery. George Bush became committed to run for president with policies that would ban abortion, gay rights, and multiculturalism. Speakers who tried to promote the traditional conservative values of individual freedom were booed off the stage.
I happen to think that individual freedom should extend to a woman's right to choose.
Go on, yeah.
William Weld was the running mate of the Libertarian candidate, I think Gary Johnson, about 2 elections ago. I remember reading, I think, Justin Raimondo's column at antiwar.com, and he said, like, don't trust this guy. Yeah, he says a few libertarian things here and there about, about abortion, for instance, but he's a neocon as well. He said, yeah, he's just another warmonger, but yeah, just more liberal on certain domestic issues, that's all.
I've always been interested in this idea because it's something that Bronze Age Pervert has talked about as the notion of abortion as a hardcore issue in America from the right actually being its own kind of psyop because it wasn't a thing before the 70s, say, and how that was all put together as part of this general project, something he's talked about before as well. You're kind of seeing it in action here. Kind of interesting.
It seems to be an issue that if you put the question to people, especially if you show them pictures of what it entails and stuff, some people, quite a large minority at least of America do think it's really bad, or that it should be severely restricted, or not provided by the state or whatever. But it's not an issue that the people came up with themselves. I mean, you've probably got the same on the left as well. It's not like all leftists are like crazy pro-abortionists or whatever, but you've got certain people who are, and they dominate the argument. But it is like an issue that's been put before us more than that has come from the people, I think. It's not such a big issue in Britain, is it, somehow? Because we don't have like the born.
Yeah, but I feel that when it comes to, like, say for example, Trump, nobody was talking about abortion back in 2016. It was all about immigration, controlling the border, and building the wall, and draining the swamp.
It's put into the news at certain points, it seems.
And I feel that the fact that Trump put those judges in and they overturned Roe versus Wade, and this is the one like great victory that Trump talks about. I actually feel that it's almost like a sabotage of what the populists were trying to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I talked to an American legal academic actually a couple of years ago. The New Culture Forum had a conference, and I went and just to check it out, and was talking to this chap afterwards. He'd come over. He was very sympathetic, and he was very big on saying Trump's got to get away from this abortion thing because this is going to kill part of his vote. The way he was sort of describing the attitude in America to abortion. As you say, it's different from in Britain, but there was a sense in which even if liberals understood the horror of abortion, there was a sense of, we like having the right there. It's like the way some people talk about art galleries. We don't go, but we like having it there. Because it's this moment of expression and agency that the liberal can sort of lean onto. Well, especially, and of course, in polarizing the male-female vote, obviously it plays to women's sense of emancipation, and that Trump should get off this as a complete landmine, because it's going to undermine his core message.
Funny enough, he tweeted about that today, saying that his position is not maximalist and so on and so forth. So
this bit of footage that Curtis has shown as well, I think this is also an example of what I said last week, that it's a story that is not really, I don't know if there's been many books written about this, not widely acknowledged, but there was, since the Second World War, I think, a fight on the American right between neocons in both senses, like the Bill Kristol types, but also the previous use of the word, which applied to like William Buckley and the sort of what you could call the CIA Republicans,
James Byrne,
right? But also them against libertarians, Rothbard libertarians, not Ronald Reagan, for instance, but this is like sort of probably a late vicissitude of that. I would say the libertarians are like completely defeated and driven out of politics, have been for a long time. But this is, just like another example of that. There was some residue of libertarianism or sort of liberalism, I would say, like old liberalism, in the Republican Party. That had always been part of, well, I don't know about always, but for a long time been part of that had been a part of the one constituency of the Republican Party. And the neocons in particular, and the Buckley type neocons, have always had a need to defeat them. Like Rothbard in particular, we said this last week, but Rothbard in particular was targeted for exclusion, not only from political organizations, but even from academia. So there's like a thoroughgoing war against the more liberal side of the right as well, or the libertarian side.
I want the government out of your pocketbook and your bedroom.
For the neoconservatives, the aim of this new morality was to unite the nation. But in fact, it had completely the opposite effect. Mainstream Republican voters were frightened away by the harsh moralism that had taken over their party. They turned instead to Bill Clinton, a politician who connected with their real concerns and needs, like tax and the state of the economy.
In the week after the Republican convention, Republican moderates, young people, and particularly women, saying, I've been sort of torn between the two parties, but where do I sign up to help Clinton get elected? I am frightened by this ultra-conservative agenda I hear coming out of Houston.
I've been a lifelong Republican. I am a registered Republican. I am voting for Bill Clinton this time. Enough is enough. It is time for a change.
Pause.
At the end of 1992,
Just to note, some of this dynamic is what's taking place here in the UK with people like Nigel Farage, that they're appealing to this frightened liberal conservative vote that sort of doesn't want to go too hard line, doesn't want to be too nasty to people.
What I would say, though, is that there's always this confusion between two rather distinct categories: social conservatism, which is basically like, talking about sexual issues, lifestyle choices, abortion, things like that, and immigration as a separate topic. And I feel like we should keep a firewall between those two things. As Curtis is showing here, social conservatism is generally not that popular at the ballot box, and it hasn't been historically. I mean, you could make other arguments, as Peter Hitchens has in the past. Like, for example, the 60s were probably more conservative than, socially I'm talking about, than we're led to believe. Okay. But the point is that anti-immigration stuff is popular, right? Whereas social conservatism, written more broadly, is not.
Yeah.
And that is a nuance I think is often goes missing when we're considering these sorts of things.
Which makes Farage's current position all the more ridiculous, right? Nobody's
exactly. I
asking
mean, I made that video. I put that video out yesterday criticizing his stance on deportations. What Farage and what people, I mean, fair play to Trump, he is doing it, right? But what Farage should be doing is actually pushing the envelope on that, because the entire political class is to the left of the public on that issue. So he should push the envelope, especially when Trump is doing it in America and the populist parties in Europe are doing it. There's no reason for. I mean, Farage has positioned himself to the left of Robert Jendrick at the moment, which is ridiculous.
He is like Farage. Whether it's because he's in some way pressured to. I don't think he is though. I think this is his actual real response. But it is the worst. Like, he is way behind the public on this. He's far to the left of the public.
And newspapers as well. Newspapers,
right. Even some of the papers, and it's not. And I don't think it is because he's under pressure. He's genuinely a kind of a centre leftist at heart, who just like business.
It's the conventional wisdom. I mean, you had Graham Brady, the head of the 1922 committee in the Conservative Party. The kind of the men in grey suits who take the initiative to hold leadership contests once there's 10% of the party vote comes in against a particular leader. Him saying, he just reiterates the smug truth. This is the reality. Elections are won in the centre ground, and they're going for those swing voters in that slightly timid constituency.
Ludicrous, honestly.
Bill Clinton won a dramatic victory, but the neoconservatives were determined to regain power.
Sorry, just on that point, it's something I've said many times as well. This notion that rightists have to triangulate to the centre is has not been proven by the facts, in my opinion.
No.
Leftists like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton have to triangulate to the centre because the public is always to the right of where the politicians are, right? So as not to, I mean, you can see Kamala Harris is doing it even now. She is pretending that she's less radical than she is to try to appeal to middle ground voters. Okay. It's a mistake. It's a mistake generally for rightists to do that, because the man on the street, most men on the street, are basically more quote unquote based than the average person in Parliament, basically. So
and they must know that. They must be aware of that. There's no way they can over decades continue to believe that they're somehow cleaving towards the public by doing that triangulation thing. Like, if it triangulating towards the left, there's no way that they can continue to believe that they're forced to do that. They want to do that. If these people like Francis Maud, Theresa May, and I would include Farage now as well, people who triangulate towards the left, they're sinister people. It's this, like, to set out to do that, to make that your aim, you have to be against the public. Like, you have to be consciously
or you'll want
to
to push,
defeat them.
you want to push the country in a leftwards direction,
Yeah,
which is essentially what the Tories have done our entire lives and what Farage is doing right now.
And entirely by choice.
And keep out your opponents on the right.
Yeah.
Most importantly.
I mean, this is why I would still say Farage, it's like he's an agent of the Tory party. But I mean, even then, that doesn't really explain why the Tory party like that. But yeah, I put out a tweet last week just saying Farage is dragging the public backwards. Like, we're way ahead of him. Ordinary people are way ahead of him. Normies,
Yeah, we are the normies. I keep on saying that. The views of us are basically the views of most people, I would suggest. The sensible centre. All right, let's carry on.
Oh, sorry. Just want to add one thing. Just since that Zia Yusuf joined Reform, there's this massive sort of Amen corner, thrilled by his speeches and the speeches that Farage has made since he joined about, civic nationalism, basically. Those people, they are aware that they don't represent even the membership of the Reform Party, probably. They are aware that they're sitting there to drown people out there, like those people on Question Time who clap really hard to make it sound like a good point has been made. But that's all they are. And it's repulsive seeing it work.
Yeah, it's true.
They were going to do to Bill Clinton what they had done to the Soviet Union. They would transform the President of the United States into a fantasy enemy, an image of evil that would make people realize the truth of the liberal corruption of America.
But this failed. Let's carry on.
احنا نشوفوا هذا الدول اللي فاتتنا باش فاتنا بالعلم والدين تاع الاسلام.
In the early 90s, Algeria, Egypt, and other Arab countries were being torn apart by a horrific wave of Islamist terror. The jihadists who had returned from Afghanistan were trying to topple the regimes. At the heart of their strategy was the idea that Ayman Zawahiri and others had taught them, that those who were involved in politics could legitimately be killed because they had become corrupted and were thus no longer Muslims. This violence, they believed, would shock people into rising up, and the corrupt regimes would then be overthrown.
They must die. Not only must die, they did kill. They did kill people. Not just, it's not just an idea from far. It became true. People killed. Many rulers, many ulama, many scholars, many politicians in Islamic world have been killed because of these ideas. Why? Because simply they are against the Quran. They rejected the Quran. Why they rejected the Quran? Because they did elect.
Ayman Zawahiri was now based with bin Laden in this farm in the Sudan. He used it as a base for his group Islamic Jihad to launch attacks on politicians in Egypt. But as one of the leading ideologues of the revolution, he also travelled throughout the Arab world, advising other groups on their strategy. But the revolutionaries soon found that the masses did not rise up and follow them. The regimes stayed in power.
So they did not learn the lesson from Egypt, basically, from last week. The masses are not going to spontaneously rise up. You have to lead them.
This is something which has sort of parallels to me in this sort of conspiracy sphere thinking at the moment. And again, I'm not being disparaging about people, in that sense but I want to say that, in the conspiracy sphere, there is this fundamental belief that, the act of revelation, if you just give people certain facts, they will be activated and they will collectively rise up in order to challenge power. And it just isn't real. It's a magical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, this was the thinking on the internet before I wrote Popular. I mean, this is why I was motivated to write Populist Illusion. It was literally against this fantasy that people have.
Yeah.
But this was a fantasy. It is a fantasy. We're all Curtises. We're all, what do you call it? Curtisonian. We're all Curtisonians now.
Curtisian, yeah.
And the radical Islamists were hunted down. Faced by this, the Islamists widened their terror. Their logic was brutal. It was not just those who were involved with politics who should be killed, but the ordinary people who supported it. Their refusal to rise up showed that they too had become corrupted, and so had condemned themselves to death.
There was definitely a logic. The logic is that you assault the leaders, you assault those who are associated with them, and eventually you assault the people who have consented to the presence of such a despotic leader, even if they are passively supportive through their silence. And then you start attacking economic institutions, you start attacking the tourists, because the tourists bring money to the country, and that money goes into the pockets of the corrupt elite. So it is an endless process.
In Algeria, this logic went completely out of control. The Islamist revolutionary groups killed thousands of civilians because they believed that all these people had become corrupted.
واش داروا هاد الناس الابرياء واش داروا هادو الابرياء رجل انت وحب مقطعين وش اللي شفناه لوهاس وما دارت هذا الشيء هذا لوهاس وما دارت هذا الشيء هذا وعلاش وحنا واش درنا حنا ولا ولادنا واش داروا خليني لا بغيت نموت.
In turn, the generals running Algeria infiltrated the revolutionary groups. They told their agents to persuade the Islamists to push the logic even further, to kill even more people. This would create such horror that the groups would lose any remaining support, and the generals could use the fear and revulsion to increase their grip on power.
The generals infiltrated the jihad ideas, the jihad groups, to put the society under fear by creating terror and violence to stop everything in the society, no politics, no economic, no everything, just to stay and saying to the West, we are facing terror. Using fear. Using fear to stay on the power.
Aujourd'hui, ils nous tuent. Aujourd'hui, ils tuent. Ils tuent tout le monde. Ils tuent des innocents, des gamins, des vieux, des vieillards. Ils ont découpé même des êtres humains. Donc, qui aura confiance à eux demain s'ils prennent le pouvoir?
By 1997, the Islamist revolution was failing. There were mass demonstrations against the Islamist groups by thousands of people horrified by the violence. And then, in June of that year, a group of Egyptian Islamists attacked Western tourists at the ruins of Luxor. 58 were killed in 3 hours of random violence. The massacre shocked the Egyptian people, and the leaders of the revolutionary groups agreed to call a ceasefire. In Algeria, a few groups held out, but they began to tear each other apart as they followed the logic that had driven their revolution to its ultimate and logical end. They started to kill each other.
It led to their own destruction. A group that believes in a 100% pure Muslim will not see that purity in anybody else but themselves. So whoever disagrees with them becomes the enemy, becomes out of the House of Islam. And then if they happen to disagree with each other themselves, then they will start liquidating each other. And they keep fighting each other. There will be infighting. Eventually it ends in suicide.
The main Islamist group in Algeria, the GIA, ended by being led by a Mr. Zouabri, a chicken farmer who killed everyone who disagreed with him. He issued a final communique declaring that the whole of Algerian society should be killed, with the exception of his tiny remaining band of Islamists. They were.
So I shouldn't laugh, but it's mental. Yeah, every single other person in society needs to be killed apart from us, you know?
Absolutely mad. I mean, harking back to our previous series, The Century of the Self, this is what Freud would have called paranoid projection. The creation of an out group which has to be destroyed in order for you not to undergo a psychological breakdown. And this is a problem with developing committed movements as such, because if there is that paranoia, I mean, you saw this with Stalin, the purges in the 30s. Even the mustache man was kind of polishing off elements of the German high command because of this mistrust, this isolation, this sort of power urge that's unable to consolidate and spread its influence. It's limited by its own psychopathy. And people who can't enhance their positions via constellations of support, master politicians like the Dark Lord, then they will tend to fall into this abyss. People will end up fighting each other over scraps, and that means it's a good way of controlling people as well, because it means they can't fight you at the same time.
The only ones who understood the truth. By the mid-90s, politics in Washington was dominated by one issue: the moral character of the President of the United States.
If you believe you've been a victim of sexual harassment by the president,
I should mention, we talked about Jonah Goldberg earlier. Jonah Goldberg made his name on this. Basically, this is how he made his big splash, was counter Clinton moral fagging, basically. That's how he made his name. So,
want to help.
Behind this were an extraordinary barrage of allegations against Clinton that were obsessing the media. These included stories of sexual harassment, stories that Clinton and his wife were involved in Whitewater, a corrupt property deal, stories that they had murdered their close friend, Vince Foster, and stories that Clinton was involved in smuggling drugs from a small airstrip in Arkansas. But none of these stories were true. All of them had been orchestrated by a young group of neoconservatives who were determined to destroy Clinton. The campaign was centered on a small right-wing magazine called The American Spectator, which had set up what was called the Arkansas Project to investigate Clinton's past life.
Not to be confused with the Spectator American version that they brought out now. That's the British Spectator over there. Correct. There was an older magazine called the American Spectator. Yeah.
I just want to interject to Curtis there that not all stories of corruption and murder involving the Clintons are necessarily made up, least of all by this little group. Like loads of people connected to the Clintons have died suspiciously, dozens and dozens. Include like Vince Foster's death. I watched one documentary about that. It's not been explained. May not have been the Clintons, but still.
The journalist at the center of this project was called David Brock.
Tonight, the Arkansas allegations in the crossfire. David Brock of the American Spectator magazine.
She was dressed in a raincoat and a hat and came in at 5:15 in the morning and had a liaison with Clinton in the game room the bottom floor of the governor's mansion.
This is getting a little bizarre. Next thing we're going to see
is bizarre, but hey, Bill Clinton is a bizarre guy.
Wait a second.
Since then, Brock has turned against the neoconservative movement. He now believes that the attacks on Clinton went too far and corrupted conservative politics.
Was Whitewater true?
No, there was no criminal wrongdoing in Whitewater. Absolutely not. It was a land deal that the Clintons lost money on. It was a complete inversion of what happened.
Was Vince Foster killed?
No. Killed himself.
Did the Clintons smuggle drugs?
Absolutely not.
Did those promoting these stories know that this was not true? None of these stories were true?
They did not care.
Why not?
I struggle to admire the heroism of a guy standing up for the Clintons, though, to be fair.
And he since became a major Democrat operative and was a major part of Clinton's attempt to become, Hillary Clinton's attempt to become president. And he specifically works for the organizations that take loads of money from George Soros.
He founded Media Matters, who are currently trying to buy InfoWars.
They're trying to buy it InfoWars.
They're trying to buy it after the judges ordered it to be broken up and the proceeds sold off for the families of the what was the shootings? I can't remember.
Well, I mean, Media Matters is no more honest than what they're talking about here from the American perspective.
Yeah.
Because they were having a devastating effect. So why stop? It was terrorism, political terrorism.
And you were one of the agents of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The stories began to grip America, and despite Clinton's denials, the Republicans in Congress seized on the scandals and began to press for investigations into this immorality at the heart of government.
Basically, the press has editorialized and pressured the politicians into saying, here's a guy that, as far as we know, hadn't done anything wrong. Nobody's ever accused him of doing anything wrong. There's no evidence that he's done anything wrong, but we think the presumption of guilt almost should be on him. He should somehow prove his innocence.
Out of this pressure, Clinton was forced to agree to an independent investigation into Whitewater. It was headed by a senior judge in Washington called Kenneth Starr. But what was not widely known was that Starr was a member of a right-wing group of lawyers called the Federalist Society that had financial and ideological links to the neoconservatives.
Federalist Society, the same ones who put those 3 Trump judges into the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh, Amy Barrett Cohen, and the other one.
Neil Gorsuch. Was that the other one?
Yeah, they're all Federalist judges, yeah.
But I assume if they appoint a special prosecutor, I assume it's impossible to hire someone who has no no membership of any group. You know what I mean? Is slightly clutching at straws there. Like, the special prosecutor is going to be either a right wing or left wing, or centrist, but that's a bias of its own anyway.
And like the neoconservatives, they saw Clinton as a danger to the country, and they were determined to prove this to the American people.
In the Merck manual, which Merck is a pharmaceutical company, they have a manual listing various disorders, and they listed sociopath, and if you look at sociopath, it tracks Clinton exactly. Somebody who's charming, who has no particular feeling at all for the people he's charming, unable to resist instant gratification, and so on and so on. You're right on the list. We had a very dysfunctional man in the presidency. That was very dangerous, both as a model and as, if a crisis had arisen, I had no confidence that he would meet it.
But despite all his efforts, Kenneth Starr could find no incriminating evidence in Whitewater. Nor could he find any evidence to support any of the sexual scandals that had come from the Arkansas Project. Until finally, his committee stumbled upon Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky, which Clinton denied. And in that lie, the neoconservative movement believed they had found what they had been looking for, a way to make the American people see the truth about the liberal corruption of their country. A campaign now began to impeach the president, and in the hysteria, the whole conservative movement portrayed Clinton as a depraved monster who had to be removed from office.
Everybody hold. Let's go.
But yet again,
I mean, he probably was a depraved monster that should have been removed from office, but probably people thought that for the wrong reasons, maybe.
This whole section of the documentary is like kind of tenuous, because the Federalist Society is not typically neoconservative. They may agree with them on some points, but it's not. It's more just what you could call like shit cons, or something, like just the useless old-fashioned conservatives, like not particularly neocon. I'm sure the neocons may have seized on this, probably just because Bill Clinton, again, like he did airstrikes on Iraq, right? But he didn't want to invade again. They're just trying to churn through all the leaders. They're just trying to cut down every tree that's in their way, sort of thing. I mean, he's connecting things that aren't that connected, or he's doing it a bit cack-handedly.
the neoconservatives had created a fantasy enemy by exaggerating and distorting reality.
They were trapped by a mythological person that they constructed, or persons, the Clintons, these scheming, terrible people who they, the noble pursuers, were going to vanquish. I think in the leadership of conservatism, during the Clinton era, there was an element of corruption. There was an element of a willingness to do anything to achieve the goal of bringing Clinton down. There was a way in which the people who perceived Clinton as immoral behaved immorally themselves. They ended up behaving worse than the people who they were attacking.
All the moral fury and the deception came to nothing. The impeachment failed because the polls consistently showed that Americans still did not care about these moral issues. One leading neoconservative, William Bennett, wrote a book called The Death of Outrage, which blamed the people. He accused the public of making a deal with the devil. Their failure, he said, to support the impeachment was evidence of their moral corruption.
Very clever parallels, though, with the Muslims, don't you think?
Yeah.
Very, like in terms of the narrative story arc. Obviously, they're going to stop one short of saying, and therefore the Neocons believe that the entire public should be killed. But
Neocon death squads.
You could say that, they are slowly replacing the entire population.
It's the Brecht thing. You replace the people if the game ain't working.
By 1997, bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri had returned to Afghanistan, where they had first met 10 years before. Back then, it had seemed as if Islamism might succeed as a popular revolutionary movement. But now they were facing failure. All attempts to topple regimes in the Arab world had not succeeded. The people had turned against them because of the horrific violence, and Afghanistan was the only place they had left to go.
Well, 1997 was their failure. Egypt, Algeria, it worked nowhere. It went wrong because populations would not back them, because people, even people who were sympathetic to them in the beginning, were frightened away by their violence, by their incapacity to communicate and to have access to the people. And this is very clear in Zawahiri's book, Nights Under the Prophet's Banner, where he sort of goes back on this experiment and laments over their incapacity to rise the consciousness of the masses, and feels that, as a vanguard, they did not manage to communicate. They remained isolated, and this is why they failed. And this is when they started this new strategy.
In May 1998, bin Laden and Zawahiri invited a group of journalists to this press conference, where they announced a new jihad. Zawahiri was convinced that it was not their theories that were to blame for the failure. It was the fault of the Muslim masses. Their minds had been corrupted by the liberal ideas from the West. But rather than give up, he believed that the solution was to attack the source of the corruption directly. The new jihad would be against America itself.
He says, as I mentioned before, we focus our efforts to fight against Jews and Christians or Americans. We have no objection against any party or any person who fights Americans all over the world. And we want to tell you that we will win the war against Americans. America will be defeated. Americans now are proud.
This was a strategy of desperation, born out of failure by a small group whose revolution had failed. And the anger that came from that failure was about to be directed at the United States. What Zawahiri and bin Laden were about to do would dramatically affect the future of the neoconservative movement. By 1998, all their attempts to transform America by creating a moral revolution had failed. Faced with the indifference of the people, the neoconservatives had become marginalised in both domestic and foreign policy. But with the attacks that were about to hit America, the neoconservatives would at last find the evil enemy that they had been searching for ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Convenient for them, really.
Yeah.
And in their reaction to the attacks, the neoconservatives would transform the failing Islamist movement into what would appear to be the grand revolutionary force that Zawahiri had always dreamed of. But much of it would exist only in people's imaginations. It would be the next phantom enemy.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but I felt that this part 2 specifically of Power of Nightmares, probably the weakest Curtis we've watched in some weeks. And I think it's because he got too enmeshed in kind of contemporary domestic American affairs, basically. And he was not particularly, how can I put this? I don't know. I just felt that some of his assumptions felt off in this one, more so than in previous weeks. You know.
I agree. Yeah, we're sort of dawdling along with his own lack of understanding, and also he's fitting everything into his initial theory, isn't he? These parallel fantasy-based movements that believe in the power of myths and whatever. He's trying to fit everything into that, and it's not that good a theory.
Would you? Would you generally agree, Simon, that this is possibly the weakest Curtis that we've seen?
Yeah. I feel conscious of being able to offer less insight on this. Certainly, I mean, the closest you can draw there is the point you made some time back about when Tony Blair was faced with possibly vanquishing the Conservatives completely, he had a moment of horrific realization that his power, in some sense, depended on having that enemy with a level of, if you like, competence, in order to face, and so that you have. There's a line in that recent musical Hamilton about people in politics. They use one problem to solve another, and so both the Islamists and the Neocons have a problem at that point, and they find each other, and that kind of then creates a narrative that lasts, a good 20 years of power consolidation. So to some extent, I wouldn't say that it's a question of these are. In a sense, fantasies and narratives are generated, but there is a very real thing in politics of resting on each other, a mutuality that allows you to persist. And by the time people have realized, it's too late. We see narratives created all the time. We see them collapse, but we don't kind of learn this until it's kind of too late to make a difference. And this is this thing I've been highlighting about noticing the tensions between the top line narratives and between actually the purpose underneath, which is for one group to displace another. Let's say the neocons in the American administration, as we saw last week, wanting to displace, the old guard there. And in a sense, the Islamists, displacing, the political moderates like Azam and taking it towards this extreme form, which then justifies this rewiring of society. We see it by, the process of changing the populations in the West. They see it by another process of changing the population by extreme violence in their case. But the returns are diminishing from both strategies.
Yeah. It is. It's still. It's still Curtis, so it's still interesting. But yeah,
He's definitely got a more clear theorem running through, say, Century of the Self, hasn't he? Well, at least a more convincing one.
And it has more durability, doesn't it? It has a longer afterlife than this looks dated, especially with the talk about Clinton. I mean, that looks very dated now.
Someone in the chat just picked up and said that Curtis just loves Clinton and he just wants to defend him.
Yeah, that I guess that is what was coming across more was like, well, hold on a second. Why have you dropped your usual impeccable value-free analysis here, Curtis?
Yeah.
You know, to shill for Clinton. Essentially, there's no need for him to do that, and it kind of cheapened the documentary for me. I generally agree with his wider point that you know, elites do create these illusions for the public to buy into, and many of them are fantasies, etc., etc. I mean, to your point just now, Simon, I think that this dynamic exists between the Israelis and the Iranians at the moment. Something my dad has talked about, that the mullahs in Iran need Israel because in a strange way, Israel keeps them in power, and even though they're gearing up for the end conflict now, everybody knows really that once that enemy is gone, the cause, if you want, the big cause or the big promise of what that regime is about is finished. So one of the reactions coming out of Israel was, oh, the mullah, you know, the Ayatollah has just signed his own death warrant type thing. Now obviously that's war talk, and a lot of people on the side of the so-called resistance have been saying, well, Netanyahu has destroyed Israel, right? But in a sense, if they do ever get the final victory, they it's like having good without evil, right? You have to have the evil. Does that make sense? And if so, if you get rid of evil, or if you get good, if Satan got rid of God, then he would no longer have any meaning himself, you know, etc. So there's something in that dialectic that is interesting to me. And in a sense, maybe it's true that both Netanyahu and the Ayatollah have signed their own death warrants, quote unquote, because even if it doesn't matter who wins, their reason for being is no longer, you know, ceases to be. That makes any sense, which is also one of the reasons why in the Boom of Truth we're trapped constantly fighting World War II over and over again, because that is the sole reason for this order existing now. And the Cold War gave the Western order meaning.
Yes.
And people have been asking, well, what is NATO for since 1991? And now in a way, Putin and the Iran and so on are giving them a reason for being again, you know. So
but of course in their own minds they have always there must always have been a reason, but it's a reason they won't stay, so then they need a new pretext, right? Putin's more a pretext. Like obviously Putin wasn't around until the end of the 90s, but NATO, I don't remember there being any talk of closing NATO in the 90s, right? So like people wanted to carry it on. I mean, probably because they intended to menace Russia with it, or whatever. But yeah, it's I think that the distinction between real reasons and pretexts is always crucial, you know. But I agree with what you said a minute ago, Simon, about like there is a comparison with what Blair, you know, like even though he considered the Tories his opponents, he also feared their destruction. And there's an element of that in this documentary that the neocons and the Islamists arguably have some of that. But do you think that's what Curtis would acknowledge as well? I mean, I imagine Curtis, you know, much as he criticizes Blair, he probably quite likes him as well, like he likes Clinton. But it's somewhat, you know, because it's centre leftist. But do you think Curtis? Do you think he's aware of that? Do you think that's what we're watching from him?
It's difficult. It's like I said last week in response to AA, that I think there is this element of Curtis that's always optimistic. He's looking for a kind of solution which sort of does away with these kinds of political games and is a sort of coming together of people to achieve some sort of higher, you know, mutuality and progress. So he is a kind of left liberal in that way, and he's constantly disappointed by people's inability to sort of organize, whether it's through ideological movements, whether it's through things like the psychiatry movement, whether it's, as you see in future series, things like the sort of Silicon Valley visions of a networked society. It constantly sort of eludes us, and Curtis's position is one of a kind of persistent disappointment, I think. And there's also echoes in this series of you know, it's expressed in culture by things like John le Carré in his novels, Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People, where he talks about one of the problems they have is that if they oppose the Soviets, the British intelligence and the American intelligence services, if they oppose the Soviets and just regard them as idiots, they kind of lose some of the justification for opposing them. If your opponents are idiots and you diminish them,
right,
then what's the problem?
Yeah, and I've noticed that the regime are always trying to run both narratives at once. They can never quite decide.
Yeah.
Is Putin this bumbling idiot who's about to die of cancer,
craps himself,
or is he this kind of Machiavellian genius? And they resolve by running both narratives.
Yeah, they just go with both. Yeah,
I've never quite understood that.
Yeah, it's like the terrifying guy who also can't even walk, and he's incontinent. And
surely, if they're incompetent, it'll fall apart.
The Israelis do it too. It's like, oh, these are the biggest threat on earth ever, and we really need your help. But at the same time, they never do any damage to us, and we are basically invincible, and our enemies are stupid, and we always win. And I've never quite got why, like, run with one or run with the other. Why do they run with both? I never get that.
The far right are complete morons who can't even figure out that no one's taking their jobs. They're just too stupid to do them. Yet we need the entire mechanism of the state to crush them.
Yeah. Well,
yes, indeed.
The war is not meant to be won; it's meant to be endless.
So, all right, there are a couple of super chats. I did notice that entropy basically wasn't working for most of the stream. So if you've got entropy, you know, send it in the next few minutes because we're about to finish here. DC said, "Good day." Maybe it's Alexander Mercurius in disguise because that's what he always says. Good day.
That's what's on his mugs, isn't it? You can buy a mug that says "Good day."
Yeah, that's how he starts his own "Good day." Yeah. well, anyway, he says, "Good day. Always a pleasure listening to Deepest Law. AA, do you know when Foundations of Shakespeare will be available?" Well, DC, I signed a book contract, and the deadline on that contract is the 1st of December. So that means that the course will be definitely finished before then. Quite when I'm going to have a chance to actually finish the course, I don't know. But most of it is written, but I need to actually record it and, you know, put all the slides together and things, and which will take some time. But I would look in the next month or so, probably the start of November, if I had to guess, for the course to be out. Crispy GT has just sent $2.34 in Australian money, which will probably buy me half a pack of pork scratchings. And Dan Qua 111 says, "Devil's Advocate vibes from I'm a fan of Man." So there we go. Are you a fan of the film Devil's Advocate? I was a fan of it. I kind of like shouty Al Pacino. I think he gets a bad rap. I like late Al Pacino is my
peak Pacino.
Well, I always, you know, I've got this idea that people find their true calling late in their career, in their settled style. Well, that's late Pacino. That's the Pacino he always wanted to be, is shouty Al, you know. You guys seen Devil's Advocate?
I've not. No.
You should. You definitely should watch it. You should watch it. You know, I'm peaking, Kevin. It's my time now. Yeah. Anyway,
he's the devil, and Keanu Reeves is like a lawyer or something. Is that right?
Yeah, and his name, Simon, is John Milton.
There you go.
And he gives when I used to teach Paradise Lost, I'd play the speech that he gives Keanu Reeves. So you'll have fun watching that. You'll have fun watching it. You know. So anyway, I think that is it for super chats. Excellent. Simon, where can people find you?
At Simon__Roberts on Twitter. Thank you very much for listening once again.
And Horus, where can people find you, sir?
I'm at Infinite Horus on Twitter, and I'm eternalhorus.substack.com.
Yes, no, do buy courses at the academic agency. I should mention, by the way, I've been forgetting to mention the merch store. You know, the Unpopular Opinions mug and the and the Now Get Out mug. It is your last chance to buy them because they are being discontinued.
No.
What, are you going to stop saying it? Or
I knew this was coming.
No, well, those because the new logo must come. Remember, there needs to be a new start, but it does mean the old merch is on the way out. So I did put up a notice, and people have got their. But it's your last chance, basically, to get an Unpopular Opinions mug or a Now Get Out mug. I am also rehauling all my playlists and things, and soon there's going to be one mega playlist with every single members only video in it, because at the moment they're scattered all around and hard to find. So that is coming soon, and at the same time there are pruned kind of nice kind of best of playlists now in each of the general categories that I do videos in, which have got the new thumbnails, which is basically the official AA canon. There was only ever the new logo. Even 7 years ago, I was using the new logo, and there was only the teal thumbnails.
We've always been at war with Eurasia.
Exactly. There are 4 lights. But yes, thank you very much, everyone. And again, I've got videos all the rest of the week. What's the day today? Wednesday. Tomorrow, the Justin Trudeau Keir Starmer comparison. Friday, I'm going to be talking about the snooker, and then a whole new suite of videos next week. I'll be back for office hours on Tuesday afternoon. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.